Good morning. Welcome at IMéRA. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. So this is the second session, actually, of a cycle on interdisciplinary approach of cognition. So the first one was organized by Dejo and Nemetz, and it was about chunks. And so today it's Laura who organized this session on emotions. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Laura, for organizing this.
Thank you.
And I give you the floor.
Yes, just quick remarks about the main aim of today's workshop. So first of all, welcome and thank you for being here. So today the main aim is to try to develop a constructive dialogue among disciplines and fields that are interested on emotions. And for doing so, we choose to focus on a specific type of emotions, epistemic emotions, and we will see what we mean for it. And I can say that the main goal, and we need the help of everyone here in the room, is to try to compare, see the differences among the different conceptual frameworks that we can employ for understanding the function of emotions in knowledge. So it's quite an exploratory goal, and let's see what we will reach until tonight. So thank you very much, and now we have the first speaker. Yes.
Thank you, but first of all, thanks a lot, Laura and Thibaut, for inviting me here. I'm quite excited to hear such a great variety of perspectives on this topic. So I'm a researcher at the Laboratoire de Neuroscience Cognitive. So what we do, we study the brain, and we're trying to understand how the brain is organized in order to generate behaviors, sensations, feelings, thoughts. And my research in particular is focused on social perception, that is how we perceive social stimuli in our environment, and how this interacts with how we control our actions. And for this, I'm using methods to measure behaviors, and methods to measure brain activity, and also methods to interfere with both. So, yeah, first when Laura invited me to talk to this workshop, I was really excited to be part of such an interdisciplinary event. But when I sat down and started to think about how what we do is related to epistemic emotions, I started to struggle a little bit. And really, I started to think in many different directions. So I tried to narrow it down to a few specific topics that we're using, or we're studying. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. So first, I'll start with an introduction and to share with you my interrogations or questions how epistemic emotions are part of our field of studies in cognitive neuroscience. And then I'll show you some experimental work, so really the kind of data we get in 4 different topics. First, the question of how in the brain perception and experience of emotion overlap, whether we have in our brain a different representation for different categories of emotions. And then I'll show you some data to demonstrate that emotions modulate brain activity during social perception, and that in turn, when we modulate brain activity, we can change perception. So, first, epistemic emotions in cognitive neuroscience. So, emotion is a really big topic in cognitive neuroscience. It is apprehended in a variety of questions. First, we study how the brain represents emotions. Are there different brain representations? So when we talk about representations in cognitive neuroscience, is how we can decode or describe information about a specific process based on brain activity. So in our case, we don't look at individual neurons, we look more like ensembles of neurons, of part of neurons, and all these questions. And epistemic emotions, in fact, are not ever mentioned in the field of cognitive neuroscience. And I think when I thought about it, I think it's because emotion is intrinsically linked to any, in the way we study it, any process that involves the acquisition, the retention, or the manipulation of knowledge. Now, in a sense, all emotions that we study could be put in the category of epistemic emotions. So that's my take. And in fact, in all the studies that you can find in cognitive neuroscience, in handbooks of cognitive neuroscience, even on chapters dedicated to emotion, you will see that that maybe not pervasive view, but like a very shared view between many researchers is that emotions and cognitions are intrinsically intervened in the way they interact in each other for our behaviors, but also in the way they are coded in the brain. And also when we study emotion, it's particularly relevant for social cognitive neuroscience. So social cognitive neuroscience is a branch I'm really part of. It's a branch of neuroscience that tries to understand how social cognition, that's all the process that allow us to perceive, but also understand our social world. So emotion is really important for this field, and actually in the big handbook, the Bible for cognitive neuroscience by someone edited by Michael Gazzaniga, emotion and social neuroscience are part of the same chapter. They're treated in the same section. And within this domain of social cognitive neuroscience and social perception in particular, epistemic emotions are particularly relevant because when you think about it, all the knowledge we gain from someone, or the knowledge we gain of someone else, is most of the time tinted or colored by the emotion they can express or our own emotional state. So just all to say that for me, in my view, most of the emotions that we study could be related to a category that we could fit in a broad notion of epistemic emotion. So how we study emotions, and also in the field, the study of emotion in the brain is really, really ancient. But how it's implemented in nowadays neuroscience is really rooted in earlier studies conducted in animals that looked at emotions in animals, so that many cats, or maybe some of you are familiar with the studies by Hess, looking at different postures of cats expressing different emotions. And that the early studies that have identified a set of brain regions that are particularly important for emotions. And that is if you make a lesion, if you damage those regions, then the animal will be impaired in the way she expresses the emotions. So that involves, so that's from a very old textbook, but it shows some regions that I'm going to talk about. For example, here's the amygdala. So here's a view of the brain if you were cutting it from the middle, of human brain here, if you were cutting it to the middle. And many of those, so the amygdala, for example, this part of the striatum here, and all this medial, because it's part of the medial wall of the brain, cortex, and here's the prefrontal cortex. So that's the front of the brain, that's the back of the brain here. And all those regions have been described in animals, but as you see, we can find them in human. And those that are represented here, they are really ancient evolution from an evolutionary point of view. So they are involved in processes that are really shared with many animals and have been conserved across evolutions. And then there are many more regions I'm going to talk about that are involved in one way or the other with emotion processing. And studies in human that are actual and more ancient too, consist of studying patients, so the neuroscience studies that have lesions in different parts of the brain and who, as a result, are impaired in emotion processing, so in understanding emotions or also in expressing emotions, or using more modern brain imaging techniques to look at the organizations of all those different brain regions with regard to emotion processing, and also to look at how those regions interact with other brain circuits that we can study that are involved in cognitive functions, like action control, memory, and so on. So within this framework, I'm going to present you just a few studies. I hope it's not too technical. So the main tool that I'm using is magnetic resonance imaging. So that's a tool that we have to make images of the brain completely non-invasively, so the same scanner that's used in hospital. And we can look at the structure of the brain, but also more interestingly at the function of the brain. But we don't have it's kind of an indirect measure of neuronal activity, and we don't have an absolute measure. We need always to compare one condition to another. It's just always relative to a control condition. And one of the first questions that studied, that I'd like to talk about, that quite well studied in cognitive neuroscience, is whether we have different brain processes, different brain circuits, when we experience an emotion, when we feel something, and when we observe someone else expressing this same emotion. And so, as I said, we need to always compare one condition or one state to another. So one easy way, or one of channels that is in which it's easy to adapt the experience of emotion to this scanning environment is to use olfaction, because there you can have an immediate induction of an emotion, and that's also quite reproducible across individuals compared to maybe other sensations. So that's an experiment that's been conducted quite a long time ago, but actually here in Marseille by my colleague Bruno Vicker, when he used the example of disgust. And he had participants lying down in the scanner, and they had a little apparatus, like a mask. Actually, it was just a hospital mask, and they could smell different substance, and the substance could be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And in another session, they were smelling nothing, like just a neutral one, but they were watching the video of someone else doing the task, and so that could be someone clearly smelling something unpleasant or disgusting or pleasant. Or neutral. So the first question is where in the brain do we have different activity when we are exposed to something unpleasant compared to something pleasant, and they all reported to feel the emotion disgust when they were smelling the disgusting smells. And the second question is whether those are the same regions when you see someone expressing it. So first, when you smell something disgusting, I don't know if you've ever smelled this fruit, I forgot the name now, durian, or something pleasant, you get activity quite specifically in very restricted region of the brain. So there were other but small regions, but this region is quite interesting. It's called the Anterior Insula. That's really here again is if you were cutting the brain like this, it's really deep inside the brain, and it's also a region that is shared with many other species. So here it's two slices coming here and here. And then when you do the same contrast, comparing observing someone smelling something unpleasant compared to someone with something unpleasant, remarkably, you've got exactly the same, or almost exactly the same regions that's activated. So that shows that it's really, we use the same resources to, when we experience truly the feeling of disgust, and when we observe someone experiencing the same. So another way to study this, I'm present, so that's more recent data by Vigarero, but that we recently reanalyzed. Another way to look at this is to look at, so that was just one example. Another way to look at this question of overlap between perception and experience is to look at, to do meta-analysis. That's here nowadays that we have many brain imaging studies to pull them all together and to look at what's common. So here when we see map of activities, it's not really a difference between a condition or another condition. It's a difference in the probability that brain imaging studies will report what we call the difference in activity, that activation will report an activation in a specific part of the brain. So with regard to emotion, experience, and perception, we could divide 163 studies based on public databases that we could classify emotion experience or emotion perception. So emotion perception most often is you show people stimuli as I showed you, or just visual images that are known to induce emotions. And emotion experience, usually it's that's psychologists. They have ways through films or music to induce, or narratives to induce, to put some people in a specific state, like happy or sad. And so what we see is that across all these experimental paradigms, what is common to the processing of emotion, independently of the channels that we choose, independently of the emotion. And what we see is that, first, if we pull all together, we've got reliable engagement of those structures, so the amygdala, the midbrain, and the hypothalamus here, and the anterior insula. Anterior insula. So those are those evolutionary ancient regions, but also medial prefrontal regions. And then within, and these regions here, fusiform cortex, is regions that are more involved in visual processing. And social, it's really the regions that we study a lot that are involved in social perception in general, independently of emotions. And then we compare studies that looked more specifically at the perception of emotions without induction of emotion, and studies that looked at experience of emotion. So perception more than emotion here in blue. We see more activity in the amygdala for the studies of perception of emotions. And for the reverse contrast, we see more activity in those regions that are more related to, that we see here for the disgust, the interior insula, as well as midbrain hypothalamus. So what we can see is that there is first a considerable overlap between brain regions involved in when we experience an emotion and observe someone else experiencing the same emotions. But some subregions might be more specialized for one process or the others. And also the difficulty, also when we were doing the meta-analysis, is that it's sometimes hard to say what comes first, especially with the time resolution that we have, because sometimes when we see someone angry or sad, we can also experience the feeling, so that's a bit of a problem with those studies of just perception. The second question like that to discuss, and that's been studied a lot, is whether there's a categorical representations of emotion in the brain. So first, the first question would be whether we can categorize our feelings or emotional experience into discrete categories. And then whether those, like discrete categories like anger, sadness, and whether than just positive or negative, and whether those classifications can have a biological correlate in our brain. And lots of the field in emotional research, in psychology, and in cognitive neuroscience, so it's based on those categories defined, for example, by Paul Ekman, and that we consider that we have a set of basic emotions that are more or less, it's discussed, it's controversial, but universal, and that most people will agree that we can categorize them like this. So that would be fear, anger, joy or happiness, sadness, disgust, and also surprise. So that plus the neutral emotion. So that's a set of 7 basic emotions. And there's really a lot of work. So I showed you that we identified 163 studies, but there are really many more. So that was just those that were suitable for the meta-analysis. But there are really a lot of studies that are trying to understand how those those emotions have a representation in the brain. And then you can see it's not just cognitive neuroscientists that are trying to see that, also Disney is trying is asking this question. So again, to answer this question, it's not my study here, it's just we can look at meta-analysis. So that also is been performed 10 years ago again, so nowadays we could have a bit more. But it was focused mainly on face processing, and actually a lot of researchers that study emotions, they will look at emotion from faces. So there's a lot of study on facial emotions, because we can categorize emotion expression based on the activation of our 44 muscles. But also for the perception of emotion, a lot of research is using facial expressions. So that's a meta-analysis that put together studies in which participants observed images of faces, like static or dynamics, expressing different emotions. So most often is the 7 that I showed you just before, the 6 that I showed you just before, compared to a neutral emotion. And the results, so that's been conducted by Fusar-Collier and colleagues, and it's not really with the greatest contrast, but like the bottom line is that, for example, these regions that I talked about just before, the amygdala, here, so here is that if you are cutting the brain like this, it's a different view, but that's really deep in the brain. The amygdala is activated for happiness, sadness, fear, but not for disgust or anger. Also, most often it's activated for anger, but it didn't come out here. And other regions that we talked about, the insula, it's also activated for different emotions. So there seems that each emotion will activate a set of regions. So here it's a probability that a study of this type of emotion, this category of emotion, will report an activation. So that's still an open question, but it seems that those most like those what I call evolutionary ancient regions, like the amygdala or insula, are active, engaged for the perception of different categories of emotions. Now, the third topic for which I'd like to show you data is how emotion impact or modulate how we perceive the social world. So we know that in the brain there are some regions or circuits that are specifically involved when we process social stimuli as compared to other kind of stimuli. So social stimuli, that's mainly that's other persons, so that's their face, their bodies, their gestures, their body, their movements, their voice, their tone of voice. And all those kind of stimuli also, they are physically sometimes not very different from other objects from the environment. We have developed dedicated brain circuits or brain organization so that they are processed in priority and more efficiently. And those regions, they are involved, they comprise regions that I showed you are also studied in the field of just emotion perception, so that's the Anterior Insula, the Amygdala, that would be deep inside, that you can see. So here is a 3D view of the brain, now from the right side, and a region of this part of the brain that we called the superior temporal lobe, and frontal and prefrontal regions and parietal regions. And those regions are interesting because they're involved in social perception, but they're also involved in how we control our actions. So I'm sure many of you have heard about those mirror neuron systems, so they're part of those regions. So that's regions that are involved both when we perceive someone performing an action and when we perceive someone without moving ourselves, but also when ourselves would execute the same action. So they have this steps. So, sorry, already half an hour. So I'll show you quickly some data that we've from our lab, where we looked at this question of social perception and how it's modulated by the emotion of the actor we observe in different modalities. So first, when we observe dynamic faces, so here people were in the scanners and we showed them movies of different faces, so many one after the other, that could have moved but not express a particular emotion, or that will express, in that case, anger. And we compared that to control stimuli. So when we do that, you see activity in most of the regions that I showed you before. So for the neutral versus the control condition, mainly, so that's the right hemisphere, the right side of the brain. You see those mirror neurons regions I was talking about, and the superior temporal regions I was talking about, and deep inside a little bit of the amygdala that's not shown here. And for the angry condition, it's mainly the same regions, but also they seem to be engaged a bit more. And when you do the direct comparison between the two, so what's more activated for angry compared to neutral conditions, sorry, the contrast is not great here also, but you see activity or higher activity for angry when you perceive angry faces here in the insula. So that's the same that was activated when you perceive disgusted expressions in Bruno Vicker studies, but also in medial prefrontal region, cingulate cortex, and those regions that are involved in face perception. That if you have lesions or damage of these regions, you won't be able to recognize faces. So we did the same during perception of hand movements, so it was exactly the same design. People could observe hand actions that could be performed, this is good, either in a neutral or here in an angry way, and compared to other moving stimuli. And the results are about the same. It's not exactly the same regions that are engaged when you observe a face or when you observe the hand actions, but they are located in the same part of the brain, that is frontal cortex, PM is stands for premotor, the superior temporal cortex. And again, when you compare angry to neutral conditions, the same regions, but a bit more when you observe someone that expresses anger. And when you do the direct comparison, here you see activity in the insula again, amygdala, and supramatrixal gyrus. So we did the same for body condition, but I think the movies don't work. But it's about the same. So the conclusion here is that when we observe someone else we have engagement of specific brain circuits, but when this person expresses an emotion, there is an increase in the activity in those regions. Now, what it means, I think I'll skip that one. That's another technique that shows about the sense that so what it means here, just go back here. So what it means is that, the emotion is really part or directly integrated in the circuits that allow us to gain knowledge of other people. And the other studies, I was like in all those studies actually we compare, we also do a lot of developmental work. And what's interesting is that those regions that are involved in social perception, they mature quite slowly, I mean, like well into adolescence. But the modulation by emotion of those regions doesn't change so much with age. So so that's something, the maturation of emotion modulation is much earlier, occurs much earlier than the maturation of emotion processing. Also, the ability to recognize emotion also matures slowly. So we have, our brain is sensitive to the emotion, but like consciously to categorize emotion, for example, like children or infants, they're very good early on, but they're not as good as adults. So it's all, to reach adults' level of identification of emotions, it's about like mid-adolescence. So another line of studies that we're pursuing is to try to understand what it all means and whether this, what it means is increased activity in those different regions for emotion perception, is to try to manipulate the activity of in this region and to see whether we can change the emotion perception. So I'm going to show you two examples of this. And for this, we use, I don't know if I forgot to put a slide on this, so I'm just going to explain how we do it. We have in this particular studies, I use techniques called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it sounds a bit barbaric, but it's quite simple. What we do, we have an induction coil, a magnetic coil, and that we place near the brain. And as you know, you may remember, when you have a rapidly changing magnetic field near a conductor, you induce a current, and that can change the polarity of the current, or you can induce a current with a magnetic field. And what we do is, so when you do that near neurons, by rapidly changing a magnetic field, you can change the polarity of the neurons, and you can do that really rapidly, really transiently. It's like a fraction of millisecond, you can change the activity of a neuron. And here, if you do it repeatedly for like one every second for 5-10 minutes, then you will, for all the regions that you stimulating, you will lower its activity for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then it goes all back to normal. So it's really, we're just not doing it's not like electrostimulation, we're just interfering with the normal functioning of the neurons, but all the current we induce, it's not a current, it's just like the normal current of the neurons. And so by using this technique, we can see like whether if we inactivate a region, how we can change the perception of the behavior. So in the first example, we looked at how we perceive emotion from voices, and we used the morphing technique to manipulate voices so that they would sound more fearful, in this example, more fearful or more angry. And the question here is because we wanted to have two emotions that have different meanings. One is being an avoidance emotion and the other one being an approach emotion. that's another dichotomy that researchers use. So that's, I don't know if it's work, but that's how that will sound. Doesn't sound at all. I don't know what I should activate, but it's not too important. But anyway, that's so in the middle of this with morphing technique, we can generate ambiguous stimuli so that people are not sure whether what they hear is fearful or angry. And for each subject, we construct those curves, so that's how often here they will rate the stimulus as fearful, and how often they will rate it as angry. And in the middle, it's sometimes fearful or sometimes angry. And we can. So the question here is that whether we can change this perception, that is shift the curve toward one side or the other by interfering with brain activity. So here we stimulated these prefrontal regions that I talked about before, and we did it either on the left hemisphere, so that's the way we represent the brain, or the right hemisphere. And that's what we found, and also we had a control condition to control that of just unspecific effect of doing something. So the control condition we stimulate here, well, shouldn't do anything. And so that's how. So that's on average the proportion of fearful responses for the ambiguous stimuli in the middle of the curve. So the curve is calibrated for each individual subject. In the case of left, prefrontal stimulation, controlled stimulation, or right prefrontal stimulation. And what you can see here is that mainly in the case of the right prefrontal stimulation, we really shift the curve so that for ambiguous stimuli, people will be more likely to categorize them as angry. So really, this activity that we see with the fMRI is really important for our conscious perception of the emotion of other people. Another study, so that's the last one I'm going to present. Another study where we used about the same logic it was part of an interdisciplinary project on dance perception. And we were studying these various aspects of dance perception, but emotion perception for dance was a really big aspect. And in this particular study, we were interested in how the emotional processing or the engagement of an engagement with an emotional stimulus can be also related to brain resources that are involved in cognitive control. So that I quoted a few studies that really have these theories of this notion that there is, in some contexts, there is a balance between the resources that are involved in emotion processing and the resources that are involved in control of actions, in executive control. And that can go in both ways. With some control, exerting cognitive control, we can lower down our emotional sensations, our feelings, but the reverse can be true, like when we are in an emotional context, it's more difficult to exert control. So it's the kind of framework we're looking at. And I say that's some theories, but like in the meta-analysis I was showing you before, when you look at all regions that are less active in all emotions conditions compared to a control condition you see those regions in prefrontal and parietal regions. Those are big different regions those are involved in social perception, and those regions are really involved in action control, and they are overall very often less active in the studies of emotion perception. So the question here is really, or the model is that we would have a balance between emotion perception and executive control or rational thinking. And we reasoned that if we could tilt the balance, like by inhibiting those regions that are involved in our control, could we change the emotional perception? To try to do it in this direction. So we use the transcranial magnetic stimulation when people were watching a dance movie. So that's, I said that was a part of the interdisciplinary study. And we had a choreographer, so it's not Rosie Kay, who did a 10-minute long choreography that could induce different emotions for us. So I'm going to show you some excerpts of this 10 minutes long, and she manipulated the soundtrack. Ah, but you don't have the sound. Sorry. No, it's okay, it's just 2 minutes. But in fact, that was like a full choreography, 10 minutes, and what we asked the subject is, when they were watching it, they had a slider connected to a computer screen, so that's just something that they moved on the screen, and that moved from continuously from negative emotion to positive emotion. So we're asking them, do you think the dance at this moment expresses negative emotion or positive emotions? And they were doing continuously as they watched the movie. And that's the kind of trace of data that we get. Those years, that's an average. So for the first part of I didn't show you the 10 minutes, but the first part, most subjects will agree that it was more or less negative, and the last part was more positive. So we see here the average, and the shaded line is the intersubject variability. It's not that much variability, so most subjects agreed on this. And so we first did that in the scanner. So they watched the movie and they were doing the rating in the scanner, and we looked at which brain regions were correlated, or in which brain region we could see a correlation between the fluctuation of the brain activity and the fluctuation of their emotional perception. I don't know if it's clear, but and we could see positive correlations, that it's more activity when they increased their emotional ratings in those regions that I showed before, the physical cortex, the temporal regions, and regions involved in the person perceptions. But we could also see a negative correlation, that is a decrease in activity when they were rating the dance as more emotional, so more positive or more negative. In those regions, prefrontal and parietal regions that are involved in those cognitive control that I was just talking about. So in another session, we invited back another set of participants to the lab, and we used the transcranial magnetic stimulation to inhibit these regions, these parietal regions here we chose. And we looked at how it changed the ratings. So how it worked, we did the TMS just to lower down this system, the cognitive system, and then they did the rating, and we did it on this region and also in a control condition. So here what you see in green is that when we did TMS on the control condition, it's pretty much the same as the people who did it in the scanner. In green here, that's more negative neutral at the beginning and more positive at the end. So the end is really when you add the Bach music. But when we applied TMS on this region here, we see not so much difference in the beginning, and it's really towards the end, an increase in the emotional rating. So the shaded line is when it was statistically significant. So another way to represent this is just to average the change between the control condition and how manipulation conditions for the segment of putting together all the segment of when people judged the dance as positive, neutral, or negative. And you see that the tendency is that when we inhibited this region involved in cognitive control, we had an increase in the intensity of judgment of the positive and the negative emotions. But it was significant, statistically significant only for the positive. So I think I should finish here. So the general conclusions, I can see that I've showed you that I think something that's quite representative of what we do in cognitive neuroscience is that most studies investigate mainly those basic emotions, but also, as I showed you in the last experiment, sometimes we don't necessarily categorize emotion, we just use positive or negative, and studies looking at more complex emotions, such, for example, shame or guilt are more, they are a bit less than. So I showed you that some brain regions are specifically engaged during emotion processing, and that's both for the perception of emotions, but also for the experience of emotions. And so like there are tons of psychology studies that show that emotions are essential for non-verbal communication, that is social communication. So what we see with brain imaging studies that indeed when the social stimuli express an emotion, so that's the face, the body, or the voice, we have an increase in the engagement of those brain circuits that are specifically dedicated to the processing of the stimuli. And we can see that this activity that we see in those regions is important for emotional perception because manipulating the brain activities there can bias emotional perception. But also, if we manipulate brain activity in other circuits, like not circuits involved in social perception, but circuits involved in action control, we can also bias emotion perception. So this has implications to understand brain disorders that involve deficit in emotion processing or emotion expression, and thus deficits, as a consequence, deficit in social communication, and as a consequence, deficit in knowledge acquisition. So that's, for example, conduct disorder, schizophrenia, or autism. And with this, I will finish, and by acknowledging all my students in Glasgow. I was in Glasgow before, and Marseille, and my collaborators in many parts of the world, and all the agencies that contributed to this work also. So sorry I was a bit long, but I can have a few questions.
Any questions, comments?
Yes, I have one. Thank you very much. Very fascinating. So about the first point, that the one about the other one, the experience of emotion, perception of emotional expression. Of course, I was thinking in a very general terms about empathy. So the question is, if you think that the framework, the literature that speaks about empathy is a good way for understanding this overlap. So this is the first point, more general. And the second one, I was thinking about visual perception. So it's necessary to have visual perception, and could we find the same overlap, for example, also with the auditory perception? So the experiment that you show us about the perception of sounds could be related to it. And are there studies with people with visual impairments to see if we can find the same overlap or a different level? So the first most general, the second is quite specific.
Yeah, so definitely, the framework of empathy, the first study as I presented on discussed the experience of emotion and discussed, it's really framed in the view of empathy and whether those, we call them mirror mechanisms. Also, it's not, in that case, it was not really what we call, by definition, mirror neurons, but those kind of mirror mechanisms that we see for action perception, we could reproduce them for emotion perception. And so it is related to empathy, but in many ways, but it's not completely the same thing, really. So to perceive emotion in someone, we need to be able to, but we don't need to be, but like most often we are able to feel what the other person is feeling. So that's by definition empathy. And yeah, the same mechanisms are in place. So that's just an instantiation of empathy. And I have to say that what I showed you on this balance of, because of cognitive control and emotion perception is also directly related to that. Because if you think about it, empathy, it's the ability to put oneself at the place of someone else, but also to know that we are doing this. And to do this, you need this connection between the control system and the perceptual system. I don't know if I'm clear, but this... and all the disorders I was mentioning where patients display deficits in empathy for many, they have also problems in this emotional processing system. And the second question was about auditory versus... Yeah, I didn't show you all the data, but we compared, but it's not the same study, but we compared perception of faces, neutral or emotionals. We did that with hand, we did that with body. We also did that with voices. And that's the same really main results. We've got specific regions activated in the brain when you hear voices compared to environmental sounds. And those regions, the activity is higher when the voices express an emotion. And we also have the same developmental findings that they develop quite late, but the emotional modulation doesn't change so much with development. So it's all parallel.
I'm completely out of the field, and I wanted to know, what are epistemic emotions?
Oh, no, you need to ask that to Laura, not to me.
As the title is saying, we are raising epistemic questions to emotions. Is this the sense of this? Or are inside the field of emotion studies, you're making a category of epistemic emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions, human emotions, animal emotions? I don't know. So I'm completely without any understanding of the main title of this.
Okay, so that's how I started a week ago. And so that's what I tried to say at the beginning. So I spent quite a good time thinking about it, what it means. So I Googled epistemic emotions. So I Googled epistemic emotions and cognitive neuroscience. There is absolutely nothing. So my view of it, like epistemic emotions, that's all emotions that would be related to the acquisition or the retrieval or the retention of knowledge or manipulation of knowledge. So for example, the feeling you would have when you suddenly understand something or you discover, or when you remember, or when you have to make an effort to remember something. So that's my understanding. But when I try to see how that relates to all the studies that we do, or that I do, or that we do in our lab, but what other people do in other labs in cognitive neuroscience, that doesn't fit. We never talk about epistemic emotions. So what I try...
This morning is an epistemic emotion. What I'm feeling this morning is an epistemic emotion.
So, and could you categorize it in as an Ekman discrete emotion as fear or sadness? No, happiness. So, yeah.
You are not pretty surprised, for example.
Yeah, surprise could be in the...
Some surprise could be...
So surprise, yeah, so we very often in the studies that I mentioned, we, not in my studies that I present, no, I didn't present it here, but we had surprise, we had surprise as one of the 6 basic emotions. But often, in my experience, but in many other experiences, that will be the one that has the most difficult results to interpret. For example, in developmental studies, for sure, because people, and we don't know whether it's positive or negative. All the other emotions, you can classify them as like happiness is clearly positive, anger is clearly negative, surprise, we don't know. That's in these classical categories of emotions that we use in psychology, in cognitive neuroscience, surprise would be the one that's more related to epistemic emotion, I agree. But then all the others could be related to the epistemic emotions too.
Can I ask something in connection to what you were showing us about this phase processing?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how exactly do you do it? Because, the reason for my question is that if you have some people there and you tell them, okay, express anger or express surprise, what would be the difference between reading the image of the expression of anger rather than actually telling people feel anger and just have an imaging of their brain activity, for example? How does the facial processing change or help better the reading of the brain scan? This is what
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So,
what's the purpose of it?
So the meta-analysis I showed you on studies looking at the perception of emotions, so very open with faces, and those studies on emotional inductions, we ask, is exactly what you said, we ask, it's not, I've never done that, but like people ask people to put themselves in a certain state, and there are methods to help them do that. It's exactly this. You compare the two, and you see that there are kind of a lot of overlap in the brain activity. So you don't need necessarily a social stimulus to induce the emotion, and the emotion that conveyed or perceived through the other person engages the same networks that are involved or engaged when you do exactly what you said, ask the person to put themselves in this state. But was your question of how we make the stimuli?
No, that's what you just said. I can understand that. I just want to know what is the purpose of reading the facial expression that you see. I'm an art historian, and that's why I'm interested in questions of visuality. Why does the facial expression that you see help you read the brain scan, rather than you just have the brain scan on the basis of a person who feels anger? You put this person in a state of anger, who feels anger, you make the brain scan. How would the image of the face being angry help in the whole experiment? I mean, I have no idea. I'm not suggesting it doesn't, but how does it help? Just wondering if the visual image itself of an angry face in some way helps with reading the brain scan of someone angry.
No, it's just we're asking different questions with different paradigms. And that's related to Laura's questions before, like with some, that's an interesting question to see whether you perceive let's say anger from faces or from voices, is there the same processes? So that's the question we can ask with brain imaging. So.
Okay, any other question? Okay, so thank you very much. Sorry.
But what I can, I need to change the, okay. No, you can't say that's causal thing, or you can say that they are correlated, but it could be for a variety of reasons. That's why the advantage of the meta-analysis is that you put together many studies that have used different contexts, different paradigms. So what you hope is that you would keep only what's common and not dependent on other factors that could create this correlation. But with IMéRA, we just have a correlation between a state, a behavior, a perception, and brain activity. The other techniques that we use to interfere with brain activity, those that inform us a little bit more about any causal link between the brain region and the process.
But then why do you wait for this, what do you aim with this correlation?
that we aim to, but we have many other more sophisticated techniques that I showed here. We try to understand how the brain is organized. And so that's the first, like, practical applications. For first, it's interesting to understand how the brain is organized, but also that has implications to understand how the brain might be disorganized in certain conditions.
Thank you very much. I think we should proceed.
I thought I was going to have to make an embarrassing admission, but fortunately the previous presenter had the same problem. When I was very happy to accept Laura's invitation, the first thing I did was go to Wikipedia and look up epistemology, which of course I learned in my high school philosophy course at some point and come across again. But I had to kind of get it back in my mind. Of course, the phrase that I could wrap my brain around the best was how we know what we know. How do I know what I know? So I know it's a very vast field. That's a horrible, pithy thing to do, but it helped me out quite a bit. And I guess before I jump into this, I would just say, as a sociologist, when I think of how do I know what I know, well, I do my own work, which is empirical, but mainly, and this is kind of connecting to the theme of this talk, mainly my knowledge is based on a lot of trust among my community of colleagues in similar areas. I trust that they're being ethical, they are conducting correct research, and it's been vetted, it's been reviewed. Most of my knowledge is really based on trust, and that's me as a sociologist. I think for many of us throughout our life, that the lights go on or whatever. There's just a lot of trust in our life. Mainly what we know is we trust other people to do a lot of other things for us, gather knowledge, and we put it together. So that, again, I'm not a philosopher, I don't think about this a lot, but I was just trying to think of myself, how would I kind of explain that to myself? And I'm going to go into a kind of a sociological explanation for where trust comes from, kind of tied to network theory. We'll get into that a little bit. But another kind of maybe less embarrassing, but a little bit of doubt that I have about this is I'm not, just to start off with, I don't know that trust is an emotion. So just let me say that. I don't know if it is. I didn't see it up in the brain scans and stuff up here. But what I finally settled on to be comfortable with was if we extend emotion, again, there's people here who are much, obviously are experts in this area that I'm not, but if we think of emotions in terms of what motivates us to do things, then trust is definitely a kind of emotion, that we're willing to do things, we're even willing to take some risks in our life if we trust that, for example, other people might also take those risks or will support us to do these types of things. So that's my kind of stretching out the definition of emotion to fit this in here. So I have some reading here to do. I hope you don't mind. I'll try to intersperse this with some comments. But this is really the first time I've prepared a talk like this. It's kind of a new area for me. But basically what I'm doing, so I told you I trust a lot of people. I'm going, in this presentation, going through people who've really kind of inspired me in the area of, certainly within sociology broadly, but certainly in multiplexity and the area of trust. This is the stuff I'm kind of working on. Much of it is inspired by this. And so to do that, we'll go way back, not too way back, but to our friend Émile Durkheim back in the late 19th century, early 20th even. So where does trust come from? Why should we trust anyone? And perhaps most disturbingly, what happens when we trust no one? In his book, The Division of Labor, French sociologist Émile Durkheim argued there was something altogether different and new about the way people worked together and trusted each other in modern society. Whereas in pre-industrial collaboration, society's collaboration and trust were grounded in lifetimes of interaction, interdependence among friends, families, and neighbors. This is what he called mechanical solidarity. The majority of people living in the cities of 19th century Europe had no legacy like that to fall back on, living in a small village, a small town, everybody knows everybody, all that type of stuff. This was both cause for alarm and cautious optimism. Much of Durkheim's writing lays out evidence-based arguments for both sides of the sociological coin. On the alarming side is his groundbreaking work on the social context of self-destructive behavior, suicide, which first was published in 1897. Being himself a chief promoter of sociology as a bona fide science, Durkheim's choice of suicide as a topic of research was both resourceful and shrewd. Resourcefully, he exploited some of the underlying fears in modern life, especially among leaders in municipal and national governments. They were concerned about things like crime and prostitution and drugs and other vices and that type of stuff. So they began to amass a lot of data, really for the first time in the second part of the 19th century. He didn't really share these fears so much as he realized he had something to work with, right, to base sociology on. So he could even test some of his questions, these kind of theoretical questions about why people are motivated to do things with empirical data. That was kind of the big step forward. These data points indicating a person's age, religious identity, criminal record, marital status, among other things, are what Durkheim referred to as social facts, the empirical building blocks of the emerging academic discipline of sociology. Rather shrewdly, he deployed these social facts to bolster a straightforward sociological argument, namely suicide, the quintessential individual act, killing yourself, could be explained on the basis of social context. Namely, different levels and kinds of detachment from social life are good predictors that a person would take his or her own life. So he, some of the things he looked at was rural versus urban life, found that people in urban areas were more likely to commit suicide. Married versus non-married, people who were not married, that is to say, engaged in a formal relationship with someone, had higher rates of suicide. And more controversially, Protestants were more likely to kill themselves than Catholics. And so some of this has certainly been critiqued over the years, but he had data and some theories to test with this. Anomie is the term Durkheim used to describe this lack of connection to others, a not unexpected outcome in the modern setting where, in contrast to pre-industrial times, the work we do is highly specialized, and our relationships with others, especially in the economic sphere, can be fleeting. In this new era of organic solidarity, this is what holds the complex, dynamic, and rapidly changing context together, is that we kind of trust people who we don't really know at all. More often than not, we now find ourselves dependent on survival for technology, shelter, food, all of this produced for us by people we probably will never know. In a way, is a kind of miracle of faith that we live in every day in modern life. The edifice of complexity and interdependence we all inhabit, however, comes at a particular cost, to wit, the built-in ties of community, social obligation, religion, and other homogeneous social traits found under mechanical solidarity are now fewer and far between. For Durkheim, it is this mismatch between, on the one hand, the human need for continuity and moral guidance found in stable communal ties, and on the other hand, the often transient, market-friendly ties of commerce and finance that leads to a personal sense of anomie, that is to say, a lack of meaningful connection to others built up over time, regular interactions with the same people. Despite this somewhat dreary assessment of life under industrial capitalism, Durkheim was actually hopeful that modern people could find a way to reintegrate and establish a meaningful basis for common expectations and trust in a very complex society. To be clear, he did not believe in the contemporary setting that we would ever return to an idolized earlier time of mechanical solidarity. Instead, Durkheim felt that voluntary associations would take on the role once filled by local institutions. In addition to giving people a kind of moral guidance, sense of common purpose, voluntary associations would also work against the undemocratic tendencies of mass democracy, which Durkheim saw as a looming threat. When people met and spoke with each other on a regular basis about common concerns and grievances, democracy could be grounded in conversation and civic participation. Durkheim's work has had a lasting influence on researchers seeking to understand the animating source of group solidarity, especially during times of dramatic social change. For example, how can groups of working people possibly hope to stand up against the repressive forces of a dominant class? One of the more fascinating instances of this occurred in Durkheim's own country, you may be familiar with, France, in the winter of 1871. Nearly a century after the French Revolution sparked a continental bourgeois uprising against the old guard aristocracy. Urban denizens of diverse social class backgrounds found themselves running the city of Paris. This unprecedented 4-month-long experiment in local municipal governments became known as the Paris Commune. After the fall of Napoleon III and the Second French Empire in 1870, the conservative French army futilely attempted to take back weapons from artillery parks defended by the neighborhood-based National Guard. The Guardsmen, who had no interest in welcoming monarchists back to power, held strong and forced the army to retreat to Versailles after returning in late May to crush the communalist insurgents. Over 100 years later, Roger Gould, a sociology graduate student at Harvard, was becoming frustrated with sociological theories used to understand how and why people become committed to political movements for social change. The dominant approach, he felt, lacked empiricism and relied too heavily on Marxist thought, which saw political commitment as a direct function of social class status, the proletariat versus the capitalist, etc. The Paris Commune, it was thought, was a kind of historical replay of the French Revolution, only this time the working class had taken up the adversarial role played by the bourgeoisie against the Ancien Regime in 1789. Gould wanted to show that armed resistance, and hence social movements more broadly, cannot be made based on socioeconomic class alone. Archival data from 1871 of Parisian neighborhoods could provide the ideal basis for demonstrating the pivotal role of multiplex social structures in generating commitment in social movements. This is one of my favorite articles in sociology, in the American Sociological Review, 1991. He takes historical archival data and maps out this central Paris, basically, who fought against the army from the National Guard, how they were tied to neighborhoods, and how the overlap of participation in the National Guard and affiliation with certain neighborhoods, how these kind of cross networks really reinforce solidarity within these neighborhoods. On the face of it, social organization during the Paris Commune was simply a matter of urban geography with place-specific identities and loyals tied to the residential zone or arrondissement in the city where people lived. Upon closer inspection, however, Gould found salient ties within arrondissements to the neighborhood-specific National Guard battalions in which residents served during the previous 2 decades of the Second Empire. It was these overlapping ties of neighborhoods and military service, sometimes coinciding, sometimes linked across arrondissements, that best predicted commitments to armed resistance against the French army. Remember, which is trying to bring back defend the monarchy. Commitment in this case was measured by the death rate in each arrondissement due to military repression. Parisian residents were much more likely to resist to the death of the monarchist-led army if they came from arrondissements with large National Guard battalions. This is especially true if they came from neighborhoods with many crossover linkages through arrondissement-specific battalions containing members who resided in other arrondissements. These overlapping networks of formal, that is to say the National Guard networks, and informal, the neighborhood networks, wherein one can know the same person in different social capacities, as a fellow soldier, a neighbor, a cousin. These kind of overlapping ties are what sociologists refer to as multiplexity. Okay, that's kind of the central idea here. In this case, it was the formal ties of National Guard membership and the informal ties of neighborhoods and family that were particularly powerful. The Paris Commune underscores a way in which social integration, structured by membership in previously existing associations, can serve as a powerful interactive basis for trust and solidarity among people in the modern setting. Multiplexity really a more contemporary conceptualization of Durkheim's social integration. This can also help us understand more recent collective action triumphs as well. Okay, so we're going to come into the 20th century here and look a little bit at the civil rights movement. Alden Morris, sociologist who's written quite a bit about this, I want to talk about him. Though he did not use the network language of multiplexity, Alden Morris' research on the indigenous organizational research of black communities in the South provides an illustrative example of how overlapping connections to the same people within local institutions sustain the early successes of the civil rights movement. His work was a challenge to contemporary theories in collective behavior, which viewed social uprisings and protests as a kind of irrational mob reaction to social strain. Right? It was also a reaction in response to resource mobilization theory, which saw outside funding as the primary determinant of success among social movements. So he's providing a very kind of different explanation to what's going on here. Somewhat ironically, the history of forced segregation and violence against African Americans in the U.S. had, by the mid-20th century, fostered a high level of internal organization, reflected most obviously in the role of black churches, their congregations, and ministers, who, as Morris points out, the ministers, they did not receive their paychecks from the dominant white population, so they had some degree of freedom in that regard. Severe segregation meant that black communities often had within them a large degree of socioeconomic diversity, such as menial laborers, school teachers, and doctors. They might all be part of the same congregation. Common grievances, lives segregated from whites, and tight-knit social bonds were the fertile ground upon which an insurgent movement could grow and attain political vitality. Thus, before outside support was available, boycotts in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Montgomery, Alabama, could be carried out and communicated efficaciously, beginning in the pulpits on Sunday morning and spreading out through neighborhood-level networks where protests and carpools for work could be coordinated directly. Common culture and religious faith were clearly part of what sustained the strength of this movement through its success in the 1960s. However, especially in the context of high-risk activism where challenges to segregation were met with violence and murder, connections of trust and interdependence were indispensable. Okay, here's a kind of another angle on this. Another sociologist looking at the civil rights movement from a different perspective. Doug McAdam. He examined the determinants and long-term effects of high-risk activism now among middle-class white college students who also had a role in the civil rights movement as well. In 1964, it became known as the Freedom Summer movement. So as the strategic use of nonviolent protests in the South garnered national attention and sympathy from outside, many college-age students from around the country felt the need to do something to support the movement against racial injustice. An opportunity to contribute arose in the summer of 1964 when the civil rights leaders organized an ambitious effort to register blacks to vote, something they had been prevented from, often violently, in places like Mississippi and Alabama. In Mississippi, the state had long suppressed black political participation through poll taxes, literacy tests, and the threat of violence. Though many young people from outside the South supported the struggle for civil rights and wanted to help, not many could or did. Using a unique set of data, which is voluntary applications submitted to assist in Freedom Summer voter registration, McAdam wanted to know, in the case of white middle-class college students, what were the determining factors for engaging in high-risk activism? More specifically, among those who had submitted an application, who actually showed up in Mississippi. Those who did volunteer, he found, shared a number of common characteristics. I think I have those up here. Yeah, so yeah, a lot of people wanted to help, a lot of people applied, but only a certain number actually showed up. So what were the characteristics that differentiated them? So one of the things is that they were biographically available. Okay, so not surprisingly, they tended to be single, younger, had enough financial means to both make the trip away from home and not have to work over the summer. Though presumably all the applicants believed strongly in the ideals of equality and social justice espoused by the civil rights movement, what really distinguished those who showed up in 1964, as McAdam argues, was their network ties. Did I get this here? Their network ties. That is, and this, by the way, tends to hold true for social movements up to this day. They were both much more likely to have previous existing ties to civil rights organizations and to know someone else who was also participating in the Freedom Summer activism and the no-shows. That is, it was, again, the informal ties, presumably it's established on college campuses across the country, that fostered trust and made the formal ties of movement participation possible. So, yeah, much research has been done since looking at social movements and the environment, civil rights. One of the best predictors of somebody showing up for a protest is they know somebody else at the protest. Okay, so again, network ties are really, really key in this regard. Okay, James Coleman. We're still lingering on the civil rights, obviously, movement, a big part of our history in the United States, but also has informed a lot of this theory about multiplexity. During the same year as Freedom Summer, sociologist James S. Coleman was tasked by the Johnson administration with the design and execution of the most extensive survey of U.S. students, their families, and teachers ever taken. This was commissioned a decade after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, which declared public segregation unconstitutional. The goal of the Coleman report was to understand in a comprehensive fashion the underlying causes of persistent unequal outcomes in the American public schools, especially between African American children and white children. The results of the study were actually somewhat contentious. Some critics even accused Coleman of blaming the victim for persistent racial achievement gaps in the schools and providing fodder for separate but equal segregationists. He was, in fact, very much in favor of school integration, just not for the reasons that the civil rights activists had expected. African American and other socioeconomically disadvantaged students in the public school system, he argued, benefited socially and academically from being around fellow students from families and from students and families with greater advantage than their own socioeconomic advantage. The diversity of interaction across categories of race and social class, not access to higher quality schools necessarily, not the facilities that is, was the crucial benefit integrated schools offered disadvantaged students, building common conduits of academic culture and practice that had been deliberately cut off through forced racial segregation. He would go on to further develop his social capital theory of educational attainment, rendering a more nuanced account of how overlapping ties of family, institution, and community bolster students' academic performance. In the early 1980s, Coleman found that students in Catholic and other religion-affiliated schools were much less likely to drop out of schools than students in other public or non-religious private schools. His underlying explanation for this disparity was what he called social closure, which regarding high school teens really meant adult supervision. Essentially, when it is almost certain that no one parent can ever know at all times what their teenage son or daughter is up to, it helps tremendously to be in a community where adults know each other and have established some degree of interpersonal trust and communication. This is most likely to happen when, according to Coleman, not only do I know and trust you through regular interaction, but I know other people who know you and interact with you on a regular basis, a kind of social triangulation, if you will. In the household, this explains the intrinsic advantage of a two-parent family over a single-parent family. And this next slide seems really basic, but it's really important. And in fact, it is kind of the building blocks for a lot of social network theory these days. So the illustration on the right side, that's social closure. Okay, so A has a relationship with B. They've known each other over time, but also knows C, and moreover, C knows about B. Okay, so there's a kind of a kind of check going on, a kind of a building of trust because of this triangle here. And this is actually when we look at different types of communities, this is kind of a more traditional way that communities were laid out, where everybody knew each other, they had information about each other, you could talk to people about other people. Certainly there's a little gossip involved probably in there as well. Whereas these days, this is probably a more typical dynamic that we see, which is instead of being part of a community where everyone's kind of connected, you can imagine kind of a broader network of all these triangles, there's a lot of branching out, okay? And in fact, when people talk these days about networking, I'm going to come to this conference so I can network, for example, it's because you want to meet people that you don't know, right? Maybe get information, maybe information about a job or whatnot. This is what a lot of us, especially professionally minded people, are doing these days, is going that one point further to get advantageous information for us. So in the modern day, very advantageous. In terms of building trust, this is actually much more advantageous and is much more reflective of traditional society. And communities where, according to Coleman, kids are less likely to fall out of school, drop out of school. Okay, so moving along. Laura, I don't know how much time do I have? Are we Okay, I think we can do this. Okay. So I just want to bring in some other conversations here about how people use multiplexity these days in sociology. Omar Lizardo is a contemporary sociologist, one of my favorites. He's there at Durkheim's grave in that photograph. I like that. He is trying to bring a little bit more of the question of culture and emotion into multiplexity. One angle on this has been to focus on culture that Omar Lizardo has done. His colleagues' research suggests that the strength of one's social ties is influenced by one's preference for popular versus highbrow culture. According to their work, the lived environment of popular culture based on sports, for example, entertainment and the consumption of mainstream products serves as a bridge bringing together people across categories of difference. Okay? Weak tie connections and social interactions are thus disproportionately based on reference to popular culture, things that everybody can recognize and comprehend. Okay? By contrast, highbrow culture, things that by definition require commitment, time, and education dedicated to the understanding of esoteric themes, is more directly tied to kind of strong tie relationships. And he argues in these days, more kind of multiplex, kind of people who can argue about esoteric themes and about particular cultural products that not everybody has access to. So a common understanding of artistic, literary, or intellectual topics typically inaccessible to a non-elite social group can bring together people with more refined tastes in close tie bonds. Though Lizardo focuses on a highbrow culture as a basis for close tie bonding, this applies primarily to societies saturated in consumer culture, where only a privileged and highly educated minority can afford to step outside of the popular mainstream. As is made evident by the Paris Commune and civil rights actions described above, however, non-elite alternatives to building close-tie multiplex communities are clearly feasible as well. What these two social movements underscore is the significance of local knowledge of social networks and regional geography, regional religious affiliations, and neighborhood histories. As anyone who has spent time in a foreign country knows, many people in this room, the knowledge of what remains of local culture can be more confounding for outsiders than, say, the elite knowledge of a Verdi opera, for example. The original close-tie culture is local culture, and is only in a context where mass popular culture has to a large degree displaced local culture that highbrow culture appears as a fruitful path for some to have their close-tie networks. And actually, so this is my first example of my own work, which I just collected a couple months ago across the street. So my children are enrolled in Leverrier Public School, elementary. I have a 7- and 9-year-old there. And my broader interest, actually, the reason I'm interested in multiplexity is because I want to know if people's connection to others can influence their willingness to engage in sustainable behaviors, if it influences their environmental attitudes, for example. So I've done this in the US using national data. I'm doing little baby steps right now trying to test out some survey data. This is not generalizable data. I have about 50 people responded to this. But the interesting thing is not if it's representative, but the connection, the variables within this data set. Okay? And the dependent variable is how often do you spend a social evening with your neighbors? Okay? And this is because the work I've done in the United States has found people who spend more time with their neighbors are actually more open to engaging in sustainable behaviors. Okay? So I want to, well, first of all, I want to see who does this. Okay? So I usually use this as an independent variable, but here's a dependent variable. And I was pleasantly surprised. It's a diverse school across the street. About half the people are either immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And this is it's an ordered logit regression. I've turned it into odds ratios. So it's maybe a little bit more intuitive. Again, don't generalize this at all, please don't. But within this sample, what I found was foreign-born people were almost 5 times more likely to spend time with their neighbors than the dominant group of non-immigrants, for example. But the biggest difference was the children of immigrants, right? The second generation were about 9 times more likely in this little sample to spend time with their neighbors during the week, spend a social evening. I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but this does speak to some of the other research that I found where neighborhood connections are really, really key for its kind of the informal basis of multiplexity. So that's my only little contribution to my own research for this talk that I thought would be kind of fun to throw in there as well. Arlie Hochschild, I think I'm going to kind of go through this real quick. She's really, really important in sociology for the sociology of emotions. You may have come across the term emotional labor, and that's all her work over like the last 40 years. Most famously, I think it was the late 70s, maybe early 80s. She did great ethnographic work as a flight attendant in the airlines. And with regard to emotion, I mean, her thing is much of the work we do these days, we're getting paid to manage our emotions. So flight attendants are the classic example. And we just flew back for vacation, and there's you really have to appreciate what they have to deal with every time in terms of just maintaining calm. You know, people get sick and whatnot. That mainly they're getting paid to manage their emotions, to make you feel that everything is okay. And service and retail, it's so much is about that. So she's done a lot about that. I'm not going to spend too much time. This is a great book. I recommend it. It was actually written during the Trump campaign in 2016 down in the South, looking at how he used emotions to motivate people, apparently pretty effectively. But anyway, if you haven't come across it, it's a good study. She continues this theme of how emotions work in social life. So I'll just kind of leave it there. So yeah, I think I'll wrap it up because I feel like I'm going on a bit here. So yeah, this is basically what I want to do for this last slide is talk about the greatest challenge from the sociological perspective, challenges that we face in terms of generating trust these days. I mean, I think it wouldn't be too extreme to say we're kind of a crisis of trust right now. In my home country, I don't think it's too far off to say that a lot of the politics is based on a general lack of trust between a lot of people, a lot of fear of other people, fear of threats, that type of thing. And there's a kind of trust crisis, I would say, in the United States. So what are some of the biggest challenges, and maybe something that sociology can tell us that we might kind of hopefully get out of this situation we're in right now, where there's just a lot of vitriol and, aiming in that direction. So first, the physical separation of diverse groups from each other in modern society, otherwise known as segregation, is a really, really big challenge in terms of trust. The lack of interaction with people from different backgrounds tends to foster mistrust and fear among groups. At a bare minimum, trust in others requires that we interact with them on a regular basis. There's ample empirical evidence in social psychology and sociology produced over the past 50 years that backs this up, right? And earlier last week I talked about the contact hypothesis, which has been around for a while. If you put people in a context where they get to know each other, have conversation, do a common project, you can reduce prejudice, reduce threat, and gain trust. Second, and this is really big for a sociologist, social inequality. Sociologist Peter Blau observed over 40 years ago in his book Inequality and Heterogeneity that what really generates mistrust in modern societies is not race, ethnic, and religious differences per se, but severe differences in socioeconomic status that assures people of different backgrounds never interact. So especially when race, ethnic, religious differences coincide with really big differences in socioeconomic status, that's when you get a lot of mistrust. Where people of different traditions, heritage, and languages are similar in class status, they are much more likely to interact on a regular basis and get along. A more equal society, as it turns out, is also a more trusting society. Thirdly, and perhaps most obvious these days, leadership matters. When political leaders condone hatred and violence towards the most vulnerable groups in society, trust in others is lost, as xenophobia, racism, and fear come to rule the day. In that regard, the greatest weapon in defense of trust is likely trust itself, especially that generated from a diverse array of multiplex ties. Multiplexity reminds us that if you want to see the social change you desire, you'll have to act in concert with those around you whom you have grown to trust through regular interaction, and whom you can count on for solidarity and the emotional support you will need during challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a great presentation, and I like very much also at the end that you came back from trust to mistrust. Because if you're looking nowadays at the French situation, you're seeing that inside the movement of the yellow
Yeah.
people around.
Right.
There's a lot of trust. They're working together. They're doing a lot of things together.
Yeah.
But they mistrust each other. If
Yeah.
somebody comes up as a political DDP,
Yeah.
delegate or the group, they say, no, he has nothing to say for us, and there's mistrust in trust at the same time. And I think sociology, who is only focusing only on mechanism of trust,
Yeah.
they gave an idealized image of social reality.
Okay.
If you look at the, I did some empirical work on the French colony.
Okay.
And I was very much struck by the...
Are you familiar with Gould's paper? Yeah, yeah.
But I found that he's only given the idealized image because inside the Paris Commune there were image of enemies, there were mistrust against the church, there were killed, there was a huge amount of conflict inside. And also this idealized image of trust, we should pay attention on the political level.
Yeah.
Macron, he is calling to the French people with the letter now, trust me, I will do the best.
Right.
And trust, which is normally an interpersonal relationship.
Right.
You trust your neighbor, you trust your woman, you trust your children, has been in the last time very much used in order to explain and to hide political controversies.
Right.
So for this, I think if we talk about trust, we should at the same time talk about mistrust.
I totally agree. The other thing, and I make no claim to having a really good grasp on what's going on in France right now, but it does seem that this point about inequality is a really big issue. The sense that people, in terms of tax benefits, it's the masses who are paying the taxes, and people who have international businesses and stuff are getting away with whatever. That unequal treatment of people, and then when you just use trust rhetorically without actually backing it up, then of course, it's meaningless. I totally agree. So I'm hoping that in my particular field, sociology, we can get some type of empirical grasp by what we mean by trust, by real trust. That is to say, when people are willing together to take risks. So for me, from that perspective, not something I'm about ready to take on right now, but the Gilets Jaunes is, how did these people organize so thoroughly, across the country, with so much, speed and effort, and really made it a really strong political challenge. What was the basis of trust that made that happen? What was the network basis that allowed that to happen? It's an incredible question for me. Again, I'm not about to take it on, but that for me, in terms of trust, is what I'd be interested in, not in terms of how Macron uses the term trust, which I think is purely rhetorical.
I was asking myself, is there inside the American sociology a kind of Tocquevillian positive image of association and so on, which came up in all this time?
I actually, an earlier iteration, I threw the Tocqueville in there, but he and Durkheim were saying very similar things, actually. His hope was voluntary organizations. And of course, these days in the United States, Robert Putnam and others talk about social capital. They're the direct descendants of that literature. Yeah.
That was a terrific presentation, very informative.
Thank you.
In your understanding of trust, how important is the contribution of judgment? And how important is judgment?
Right. So,
how important is judgment in our understanding of emotion?
Yeah.
It seems to me that judgment is veering away from the understanding of emotion. It seems to be more rational than emotional. But your understanding of trust?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I hadn't thought of that word judgment, but one of the things that's really important, which is why I still think Durkheim's theoretical work was amazing, is this thing about regular interaction. So it's not just that regular interaction produces trust, but it also lets you know who you can and who you cannot trust. Some people, they come through for you, right? And other people, they say something, but over time, you know who you can trust and who you can't.
It's based on knowledge.
Yeah. I believe that's why it works.
Not instinct or gut feeling or emotion.
It's probably a mix, how most of us work, but we have experiences with people where that went well, but I don't trust that person anymore. And then you have to work to gain that trust back. If someone really messes up, you have to demonstrate that you're worthy of it. So You don't need a kind of a sociologist to figure it out. I think day in, day out. And why social movements are successful is because they're built in a community where everybody knows each other. They know who to go to for certain types of information. Other people are good for this, but maybe they won't be good in leadership positions or whatever. You know what you're dealing with. And I think that speaks to what you're saying about judgment, though I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. But the interaction over and over again lets you know. I think you had your hand up first. Go. Yeah.
So I was wondering whether models of social networks in real life are directly transposable to social networks through social media.
Well, that is, I was hoping someone would ask that question. And it kind of relates to your question.
Exactly.
So there's some really interesting writing about that. One of the most interesting, actually, he's not a sociologist. He writes a lot about sociology. Is Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if he's like a writer for the New Yorker or whatnot, but he's a great sociologists hate him because he takes all our work and kind of makes it very digestible. And I was like, wow, what a great idea, Malcolm. But he had a critique of what was it? Yeah, it was the Arab Spring back in 2010. And much in the media, it was about, oh, isn't this amazing how Twitter and how people came together and protested and brought this challenge to the Egyptian government and whatnot. And his thing is there's a lot of real optimistic talk that online networks, social networks, would be this kind of new conduit to very powerful social movements. But what he very eloquently encapsulates in that article, I forget the name of it, it's 2010, but is that you don't get that face-to-face interaction. You don't get that history of trust. You get a bunch of people that like you on Facebook, to retweet you, whatever. But it's not that interaction over and over again. That this is kind of a different type of thing. And then he says, don't get over-optimistic about these social networks. They're not the same thing. And it's a big challenge because I teach a seminar on social networks, and most of the undergraduates find everything we're going to talk about Facebook and Twitter and whatever, Instagram, but that's not it. I mean, there's a long, long literature in sociology going back to the 19th century that contributes to social network theory. And I'm pretty skeptical. And moreover, I mean, there's the other thing too is all this stuff about how children growing up, surrounded by media and stuff like that, how they're losing social skills, how they don't go on dates as often, as they don't have as many friends. I mean, there's some really disturbing stuff coming out of overexposure to media that kind of takes away from the face-to-face interaction that in the literature is really important.
And also to complement what you talked about just before about the trust, that's really a large body of literature in psychology that shows that in a face-to-face interaction you form a first impression.
Right.
And that's really hard to get rid of this first impression.
Yeah.
And when you do some multidimensional modeling of this first impression based on classification, let's say, so two dimensions that come as the most important as trust, or whether this person is competent or not competent, and attractiveness. And basically you can, your brain places the pieces of the person based on their faces on those four primers of someone.
For me,
and that's something that's like kind of automatic, and to get rid of that truth knowledge takes a lot of time.
Well, this is the thing, though. Like, I mean, what I'd really like to know more about that type of work would be like a kind of a longitudinal. Like, if you get your first impression, what if you have to know this person for like 20 years? It's like that's real. That's what trust is about. Exactly. Somebody walks in the room. You look at their clothes. We work with the information we have. But relationships imply a lot more information and a lot more possibility for knowing who people really are. So there's kind of superficial glaze, but then kind of the deep network stuff lets us know who can rely on and who can't. Really rely on.
When you vote for someone, you don't know if you just have to.
Well, that's also a problem with representative democracy, and I think Elliot, you had your hand.
So you said that you're kind of optimistic and you thought you could take steps as individually and as a family to address. I think there's more like
government and the state needs to work towards promoting voluntary organizations. Okay.
In contemporary sociology, where are we with the extent to which you can do something about your society if it's suffering from a lack of...
Right. Yeah, no, it's, I mean, yeah, I'm a sociologist, so yes, it's structural, right? Like how do you make the structure such that people interact with people on a more regular basis? Like kids play outside with each other, you know, or these things that we've been moving away from for like the past 40 years or so. It's, yes, structurally it's a really big problem. I mean, yeah, you know, in my undergraduate courses, you know, my main thing that I hope students get at is that they go out of their comfort zone, that they get to know people different from themselves. And that's one of the best things for yourself as an individual, it's healthy, but as a society, to know people, interact with people who are different, you know, religion, race, political views, whatever, that's our greatest hope. As other people have, and with science as well, have noted, you know, we've been separating ourselves for many decades now, and we even live in different parts of the country as people with similar political views. In addition to racial segregation and socioeconomic segregation, we're politically segregated such that we aren't often on a regular basis exposed to opinions different than ourselves. So I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, but yeah, it's a big challenge. Yes.
Okay, the last question, and
yeah.
then we'll have a break, and so we need to drink break for the
Okay.
I would like also to provide a final remarks about this, not just for me.
it's just
Yes.
about collaboration between mistrust and trust. And of course, if you try to find emotion in the landscape, you have to consider the change from trust to mistrust and from mistrust to trust.
Yeah.
And there are domains of knowledge in which you change from trust to mistrust.
Okay.
And there are here epistemic emotions.
I'm just curious, so from what you're referring to, at what moment does that click? What's the toggle mechanism?
Yeah, it could be a knowledge mechanism, epistemic mechanism.
Okay.
Or it could be, for example, we feel that another person despite us, and we change to mistrust.
So you do the emotional reaction. Yeah, got it.
It's really emotional and not mainly
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so as a remark for our dialogue, I'd like to say that I think that there are many points that we can develop together in some way, because it's a good way for taking emotion from a subjective point of view. So finding emotions in real life relationships, the constitution of this social network, etc. So this is the first point that as a philosopher, and I think from my point of view, is very important to look at sociology for understanding this. This is the first point. And then if you take the social capital literature, so if I ask, okay, could it be a good conceptual framework for understanding emotions? I can say that for the moment I can say yes, because we can ask if emotions are among the resources that are used and also manipulated for acquiring certain goals.
Sure.
And if our goals has to do with epistemic goals in epistemic communities, but also in social movements, as you spoke, how the groups make the decision for undertake a specific social action, etc. What is the role of emotions there? It is positive and negative values, because you also spoke about this emotional labor, so how they are manipulated as processes. So I'm just saying this for showing that there are many connections and for developing this dialogue. Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you. Thanks.
I apologize for my absence this morning, and I would like to thank, in the name of Centre Granger, Laura for the organization of this workshop and for inviting me to moderate this session. We'll begin with Laura. As you know, she's a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, where she led the project Emotion First. And her area of specialization is philosophy of emotion. She's working on the epistemic role of emotion in collective processes of reasoning and decision-making. The title of her talk is Embodied, Banded, Extended, and Active Cognition. Cognition sound like a brand, so I prefer embodied, embedded, extended, and active. I let she else speak.
Yes, thank you very much. So today, what I wanted to do today is to try to test the framework, the conceptual framework of cognition, for seeing if it could be a good way for understanding the role of emotions in knowledge. So for who of you have already hearing me speaking about epistemic emotions, I also use other conceptual frameworks. So today is kind of an exploratory mission into this very interesting, fascinating, but also challenging framework for understanding our mental states. So now I'm going to introduce some of the references for let you come with me in this exploration. So what we mean for 4E cognition. So as it is already said, 4E is for embodied, embedded, and active and extended cognition. So the main idea for this approach is to try to understand cognitive processes as a result of a mutual interaction and integrated functionality among brain, body, and environment. And so this framework is a very, can say, broad and with many differences within it. So there are also tensions. So my aim today is also quite difficult because there are different schools of thought, etc. But I can summarize in some way, in general terms, that what this framework wants to do is to challenge the computational and representationalist account of cognition. What does it mean? The idea that cognitive processes represent reality in a computational way, so as operations among processes, and this operation derives from operations among neural functions. So the idea of this framework is that we have to look at the direct perception, at the first-person experience, both singular and plural, for understanding cognitive processes, and that's why the main aim is to look at the embodied experience, the embedded in the situation, how it is related with actions and action tendencies, and how artifacts and technologies may be integrated in these processes. So it's a framework that is against the dualism between mind and reality, but also the dualism between mind and body. Okay, so the idea is that body is not just the recipient of the stimuli that comes from an exterior world, but that the body is but that the mind is in the body. Okay, so that cognition is embodied, and that the body can provide immediate information about what is going on. So in philosophy, we also say that the main challenge is against internalism. This is, again, another technical term, but the idea is that for this approach, we do not need to look at mind as an inner process, in some way locked within our boundaries, but that the mind is not just our brain, is also our body, but also our interactions with the environment and with other minds in a kind of direct and immediate way. So the consequences of this is also that this approach would like to challenge epistemic individualism. So the idea that we can know by our own, okay, so that when we want to understand mind, we just think about one single epistemic agent. But here the focus is on interactions, right? So the interactions among different, not just interlocutor participants, but also culture, practices, artifacts. So it's a very dynamical, I can say, approach of cognition. Today I cannot argue for it, okay? Because my main goal is try to understand emotions within this framework. So maybe in the Q&A or later on we can discuss if it is a good model or not. So for the moment, just assume it as our framework for today's experimentation, okay? And so the second point is epistemic emotions, because I wanted to bring emotions in this picture. And here I offer a definition of epistemic emotions. So the first thing that I have to say to you that there are people that think that epistemic emotions do not exist, okay? And as a category, of course, so that we cannot really differentiate among epistemic, moral, political, aesthetic emotions and stuff like this. And then there is also these other issues that we can employ different terms. So I can say that in the 90s, there were quite a lot of studies on cognitive emotions or conscious emotions, and in some way these concepts overlaps, okay? So I think that it is important to employ the concept of epistemic emotions because it immediately brings to the idea that certain emotions perform a specific epistemic function. What does it mean to play a specific epistemic function? So in a weaker way, we can say that are those emotions that have to do with knowledge, and knowledge practices as knowledge acquisition, knowledge retrieving information from the environment, remembering, taking decisions. So here is just to find a correlations between certain type of emotions and these different processes of knowledge acquisition. A mind definition of epistemic emotion could be the one that say that are those emotions that are directed at knowing. So here we are not just speaking about a general correlation, but we are saying that these emotions are motivation for knowledge, okay? So that trigger specific processes, specific cognitive processes that lead to or try to lead to knowledge acquisition. And I can say that this mind definition is the one that is the most accepted within the circle of philosophers, okay? And that derives mostly from Morton, that wrote a paper on epistemic emotion in 2010. There is a stronger definition, that is the one that I employ, but I cannot argue for it today, but I want just to mention that emotion are epistemic if they contribute to the knowledge achievement. So the difference with the mind one is that they are not just a motivation at the beginning of the process, okay? So just as something, the fuel that put in place a process and then disappear, okay? But they constitute in certain ways, in certain specific way, the cognitive process that make it different from other processes. So let's see also the challenges that are brought by this conceptual framework. So understanding emotions as epistemic. So the first challenge is against the idea that is quite traditional in philosophy, that emotions are detrimental for knowledge. So the opposition against the dualism between emotion and rationality, okay? So I can say that in support of this challenge, we have many results, mostly from affective science that show the integration between emotions and rationality and cognition, okay? And the main point here is to recognize the evaluative power of emotions. So how we make judgment through emotions, how we understand the environment through emotions, a specific affective evaluation. And this in technical terms is called appraisal, okay? So the second challenge is against the idea that emotions are passive states, that are just reply to stimuli, responses. And here the focus, and outside our control. When we speak about epistemic emotions, we wanted to look at the active stance of emotion as motivation. So remember the second definition, so what triggers these processes that lead to knowledge. And the idea is to see the action tendencies that are implied by emotions. And another correlated point to it is that we have the ability to master our emotions. So we can have this experience of conscious and complex emotional states that we can direct towards certain aims. And the third point that I think that is implied by this account on epistemic emotions is try to avoid two extremism. So the extremism that say that emotions are just mental states, and the other extremism that they say that they are just bodily feelings. Again, in this integrated picture, I think that the main point is to see how they are both mental states and bodily feelings, and the question is also how mental states and bodily feelings are happily integrated, I can say, as Andy Clark put it. So I think that the third challenge brings the focus to the 4Es. So to this idea that cognition is embodied, embedded, and active and extended, because this view to want to challenge this dualism, these two extremisms. So in this way, we can try to understand the emotional functionality within an integrated system where interaction plays the main role. So today's plan, what I'm going to do, I will first describe the main feature of each E, so don't worry, now we are going to speak in detail about what does it mean to be embodied, embedded, and active, and extended. And I will try, so we don't have so much time, to see the functions that the emotion may play in each of these E. And I will specifically look at extended emotions. And finally, I will assess. So I told you that this is kind of a text, kind of an exploration. I will highlight the strengths and the weaknesses of this approach. And yes, this means discussing exactly this relationship between emotions and a conception of cognition that is embodied and embedded and active and extended. And this is a correlate outcome of this presentation, maybe, is try to see the consistency of the thesis for which emotions are simultaneously bodily and cognitive evaluative. Okay, so E for embodied. Let's start from the first E. So the main idea is that the physical basis of cognition is not just the brain, but includes the body. Here the assumption is not just to take in a narrow way, of course, the brain is body as well, okay? But to try to see also the other bodily mechanisms, so the chemistry of the body, the hormone systems, and other stuff. So not only from the neural point of view. So the idea is that here cognition is not a detached practice of reconstruction an external world, making inference mostly, but it's something that is lively, that started from the first person experience of the knower. And about the emotions, of course, the main reference is the work by Antonio Damasio that Maria Elena has already mentioned. And the idea is that emotions are at the ground, are the roots of certain cognitive processes, mostly making decision. And there is also this idea that came from evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, the idea that the function that they play is try to regulate and the body function for reaching an equilibrium, okay, the homeostasis. And yes, here we have some references also to Jesse Prince that is another way for speaking about embodied cognition. So he looks at James and the idea that emotions are first bodily feelings as a way of assessing what is going on, and so he's taking emotion also from the point of view of perceptual theory of emotion, so taking as this direct perception of the situation, and this provide information for assessing it and deciding how to act. So let's take this framework and ask, could we find some epistemic emotions here? What does it mean? So the question could be reformulated in this way. What can we know through the body? What embodied emotions know? So let's start in this way. So my tentative answers are these. So yes, so if we look at the question from the point of view of embodied cognition, we can say that emotions are signals of bodily needs and expectation. And I look directly to desire-based emotions. So let's take hunger as an example. So let's start from the bodily experience of feeling our stomach empty, maybe having headache, but also be a bit in anxiety and are irritable in some way. And what does it say to us? What does it say to our situation of our body? That our body needs something, so that we have to try to rebuild again the equilibrium. So we acquire information about our body situation, but also has to do with these drives that comes from our body. So the idea that our body says something about our needs and our expectation. One, I introduced in here this word because when we are hungry, maybe there is a wonderful slice of cake in front of us, we see it as wonderful, really. So our perception makes us apprehend this object as wonderful. But if I have already eat 3 slices of cakes, I say, oh, okay, it's nice, but I don't need it, okay? So how our expectation of getting this slice of cake and having the chance to eat these change depending from our bodily situation. So this is one way. So the epistemic function will be the one of acquiring information about our body situation and also about our appraisal, our desire, our needs. So the second way for getting to the point is looking at social interactions. So here the example is the one of affective touch. So just think about when in a romantic relation or the relation between among friends or a mother and a child, what touching each other can reveal about our relations. So I think that here the affects that are in play in it as an epistemic function as well. So they reveal social bonds among the partners and also social understanding. So we understand each other as friends or partner or the mother that takes care of me, someone that I can trust, etc. And about the social interaction, we can also think about dancing tango. We have some publication about this that are quite interesting. So there is the idea that for really being able to dancing together, to be an expert tango dancers, we need to have what has been called interbodily affectivity and intercorporeality. So how our affects are modulated in the real bodily interaction for playing tango. So the epistemic function here is that for getting to the practical knowledge and expertise of dancing tango together, we need a certain level of affective component. And these also provide joint attention. So again, if we take this image of reaching the equilibrium, so for having this capacity of dancing with another and being balanced, so maybe bringing my body schema in the other's body, etc. So it seems that this affective component is at play there. So this was the first point. I have to go a bit quicker, sorry, because I understand the time concern. So if we're embedded, so here again, the bodily experience is very important, but the focus here is to look about the social embeddedness. So how cognition is contextual in a specific culture and environment, and how there are these cognitive and cultural niche that have an impact in the way through which we perceive and understand the reality. So here emotions are taken our social and intersubjectives. So they are social signals, and they have to do also with our active engagement with the others and the environment. So again, let's see epistemic emotions here. So the question may be, what do we know through affective social interactions? How much does the affective atmosphere modulate our epistemic practices? So there is a lot of literature nowadays on affective scaffoldings, so how structure of the environment are affective, and they modulate the way through which we interact in the world. And so an example on an affective scaffolding is listening music. So our specific kind of music modulate our moods, so it has to do with self-regulation, but also self-understanding. So maybe if I'm listening blues, I can understand that these ambivalent emotions that I cannot give a name about this that I was feeling was kind of a sadness, because maybe the day before I had something happen to me, etc. So I think that affective scaffoldings, if we wanted to look again at the epistemic functions of the emotion, trigger processes of self-understanding. And also, and this is the second example of affective arrangements, I don't say very much about it today because we have an expert, so this afternoon we will have a presentation by Philip Büchner about affective arrangements, but here the idea is not just to take the structure of something that is outside in some way ourselves, but something also that regulates our interactions. So for who of you know me, I take cooperation and teamwork as a case of affective arrangements. And so here, as Thomas said before, I think that in this context, emotion are working as motivations and socially extended motivation for taking decisions together, learning, and stuff like this. So let's move to the third one, that is E for enactive. So I have to say that here we do not have to take these E as separate from each other. So for the enactivist, what the embodied and the embedded account said is correct, okay? So it's more a summative account. We are scaling a bit the layers. The novelty is to look at action as the beginning of cognition, okay? So there is the idea that cognition emerge from the active engagement of an organism in its or his environment. And this action is really what enables perception and cognition. So this is the first point, looking at action. And the second point is to really look at the experience of the organism or of the subject. And so this means to look at phenomenology also in the philosophical terms of looking at our phenomenological tradition, So the main reference here is Merleau-Ponty, the idea of a living body. So the body is not just a passive corpse in a realm of objects, but is a body with desire that is experiencing affects from a first-person perspective. So here, what can we understand with epistemic emotions? So differently from the other cases, I think that here the point is to understand the very same process of an active cognition as an affective process. So the idea that the organism feels the environment and through which can generate cognition. So here the point will be that this emergent cognition is always affective. And this has been called by Giovanna Colombetti primordial affectivity. So there is this ground, these roots that belongs to all the organisms that is affective. Okay, and from there, everything and more complex processes arise. And another way for looking at this is looking at valence. That is another key word, and I would like to read this quotation from Nathalie Deprat that is going to speak this afternoon. So just quickly, and Francisco Varela. So the primordial constitution of self-affection as a dynamic polarity, as manifesting itself in the form of attention that takes several forms, like, dislike, attraction or rejection, pleasure, displeasure. So here the point is that we cannot just only look at this affective engagement with an environment as the source of the generation of cognition, but that also this engagement has to do with a polarity and has to do as a strong hedonic value, so something that looks and is felt as pleasurable or displeasurable, something that attracts ourselves or produces a movement of rejection, and this is exactly the balance of this affective experience of being coupled with an environment. So if I have to ask again, what is the epistemic function here? Is the very same process of sense-making. So provide a meaning of what is going on, and also this idea of affective appraisal, so that the evaluation that is produced by this affective engagement is modulated by processes of valence and primordial affectivity. The second way for looking at this point within an active tradition is to look at the affective dimension of participatory sense-making. Here I'm thinking especially at the works by Thomas Fuchs and Hanne de Jager, Ezequiel Di Paolo, etc. So the idea that this process of sense-making is not just individual, but is made through networks of interaction in a very participatory way. So here the key word is participation, okay? And here I have in mind a wonderful paper by Dan Zahavi, You, Me, and We. So there is the idea that there is the experience of you, mine experience, and together we build our experience, an experience that is under the ladder of we experience. And the idea is to look at the affective dimension that roots this intersubjective understanding. So the idea is that intersubjectivity here emerge from this affective entanglement. So at the phenomenological level, we can discuss the quality of mutual incorporation, so the quality, the specific affective tone of our way of being together. And at the cognitive level, I think that we can look at emotion again as motivation for staying together, for nurturing our relation and cooperation, for building shared meanings. So before we spoke about sense-making as the epistemic function. Here, it is a social process of sense-making. So the last one, so there are someone that say that we can add also other E. But let's say that this is the last one, so E for extended. So here we're speaking of a bit different story. So the idea that the mind does not stop at the brain, it does not stop at the body either, but it extends itself through the environment in specific way, okay, and under certain conditions. Okay, so the main example is how we use technologies, for example, a mobile phone, as part of our cognitive processes. For example, for retrieving information about the phone number of our friend. Okay, so the idea is that the mobile phone is not just an external tool that I use, but it's part of this cognitive machinery, so it functions as a part of the process. So here we have some conditions that should be guaranteed. So the parity principle and the functional equivalence. I cannot deep the analysis into it, but there is the idea that an internal process and an external process of integration have the same value. So we need to overcome this dualism and give more value only to brain-centered processes. And why Andy Clark and David Chalmers can argue for it? Because they're looking at a functionalist view of mind. So they say that their function is the same. So if we need to assess this from a functionalist point of view, we can really need to ascribe also to an external tool a cognitive role. So here the question is if emotion too extend in this way into the world. And there are many papers about this. Here just quite a narrow list, but there are more. So let's see. The first way for understanding emotional extension is to look at emotion as supervenient to extended mental states. I can say that this is the more traditional way of looking at it. So if we accept that there are extended cognitive processes, we can see that emotions are supervenient to these processes, and that's why they are extended. Okay, I can say that the main role is played by cognitive processes and recognize that these cognitive processes are also affective. And in this way, we can say that, yes, we have extended emotions. But are also they epistemic? So do they contribute in some way to knowledge acquisition, etc.? So the example here is affective remembering. So let's think about when you look at the photos that you have in your mobile phone about last year holidays, and just looking at these photos, you start to remember things that you forgot. So you remember, yes, this beach was so nice, I remember the music, the sound of the waves, the people that I met there. And when we engage with these processes of remembering, many times emotions help us in remembering. So, or also if we watch a movie and the day after I speak with a friend, you see, I saw this movie, it was very nice. And if the friend asks, okay, what it was about? At the beginning, maybe you do not remember the plot, but you have an impression. You say, yes, it was a romantic movie. It moved me a lot, yes. And then you start to remember. And it's interesting also in this dyadic interaction. So this affective remembering can play also in interaction. So, for example, a couple of friends that started to remember the 10 years ago holidays, and they say, you remember this bar? Yes, I remember, you remember this ugly person, etc., etc. So it's a way of retrieving information. And again, also here we can find the epistemic function of self-understanding, also about what we like. So I enjoyed very much last year holidays in Greece. So we say, okay, next year we go to Greece again because I like this place. Okay, so the second way is to look at the parts of the environment that play cognitive function, okay, for looking at the epistemic function of extended emotions. So here I have the example of assistive technology. So this is a touch-focused approach. So here I'm thinking exactly people that need to use some technology for reduce their cognitive impairments or also physical impairments. So I did a study with the students that are at the blind school in Edinburgh, and we started to look at the cognitive integration between the student and the technology. And what we started to find that is not just a cognitive integration, but is also an affective integration. So the students need to, again, to trust this technology, rely on it, feel that it's something meaningful for our life. So what we call in the extended mind literature glue and trust criteria that should be guaranteed for having really an extended processes, I think that are full of affective dimension. So this is the first day. The second one is to look at action, so to look at the experiential aspects of emotions. So just think about some practices like writing a diary or playing blues. So you're not just listening music, but you are incorporating the sax and you use the instrument for expressing yourself. So the idea here is not just that you are expressing your inner feelings, but playing the sax helps you to understand your own feelings, to enhance, again, your self-understanding, self-mastery, and self-modulation. Sorry, I have to wrap. The third way is to look at the extension through social interactions. So we are moving from technology actions and how these emotions are embedded within social interaction. And here again, we can look at some experiential and bodily aspect of emotion. Here, the main way of looking at this is the relationship between infant and caregiver. So how the development of the infant is gathered through a specific interaction with the caregiver, etc. I cannot fine-grain it here for time concern. So let's just go to the conclusion, but I need at least 5 minutes for assessing the point. So let's see the strengths of this way of understanding epistemic emotions. So I think that the first strength is to bring emotion in a broader picture that is able to integrate our multiple components. So you remember that one of the underlying thesis was, let's see if we can understand emotion both in bodily and cognitive evaluative terms. I think that look at epistemic emotion in for recognition help us in doing so. So this is the first general strength. The second one is that there is not a non-reductionish account of the mind. So if we take mind as these active cognitive processes, we look at this in a very dynamical way, and we really focus on the entanglement among brain, body, and environment. And as I told at the beginning, I think that in this account, emotions really express themselves as an active force. And also, last point, that we have some good examples. So it's not just conceptual and theoretical. I try to show you how in our daily real life we have examples of this way of understanding emotions. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. We need to further investigate, etc., etc. So these are the strengths that I see. There are also some weaknesses. So the first one that is very renowned in the literature is the marker of the cognitive. So it seems that when we extend the boundaries of cognition, so starting from the brain to the body, to the environment, to the social interaction, practice, etc., we cannot really understand finally what is cognitive. So it seems that everything is cognitive in some way. So from a philosophical point of view, this could be problematic because you are not able to provide a clear definition, try to provide distinction among the other states. So this is a huge problem, I can say. The second weakness is expressed by the tensions within the framework. Okay, so as I told you, under this umbrella of for recognition, we have many accounts. And yes, I tried to show you kind of development, okay, from the first E to the second, the third, the first, but there are tensions. For example, about representationalism and direct perception. So at the beginning I told that for recognition challenge representationalism, but for example, if we take the extended mind hypothesis, we have representationalism there that seems in contrast more with the enactive approach. And also, it seems that there is a tension, again, between functionalism and the idea that we really need to look at the real experience of the subject, their phenomenology. But I can say that these tensions are also good because they can nurture the debate and the development, etc. So at the first way of looking at them, they are a weakness, but maybe they can be beneficial too. But the main weakness, in my opinion, is that we need to assess the reliability of the knowledge acquired. So I try to show that, yes, we have emotions in this account of cognition. I show how they perform epistemic functions that have to do or contribute to knowledge. But is their function reliable? So the kind of knowledge that they get us is something that we can confine, regulate as conducive of true beliefs and stuff like this. So this question brings to epistemology. So today I provide an account of epistemic emotions more from the point of view of philosophy of mind. But I really think that if we want to assess the epistemic functions of emotion, we really need to bring the discussion to epistemology, that is the theory of knowledge. And so for me, but this is only one option, there are others in the market. This means to look at virtue epistemology and at the ethics of knowledge. Why I'm saying this? Because I think that for really understand the role that emotions and affectivity can play in our epistemic life, we need to look at the character traits that build the epistemic subject in the concern toward knowledge. So thinking affectivity as this care and concern for knowledge, and this as a way for assessing their epistemic value. So I look for an integration between for recognition and virtue epistemology. This is one of my ongoing projects, but today I did the starting point, that is to bring epistemic emotions to for recognition, and yes, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for critical summary of your focus. So I think we have 10 minutes. So are there?
Laura, thank you very much. This was a really thought-provoking talk. And I have many ideas, but I just want to go to what looks to be the most important thing. I feel convinced that emotions play a role in the acquisition of knowledge. What I'm not so certain about is that they always contribute to the acquisition of knowledge. Now, you gave us a lot of examples, and I think that you could come up with as many examples that show that emotions actually prevent you from acquiring knowledge, or the examples you gave can be turned around. Like, for example, with memory, that your emotions make it easier for you to remember things in the past, but at the same time, your emotions also suppress things in the past because you don't like them, you are disgusted by them, or, So the thing is that I wonder whether your definition of epistemic emotions as they play a role in knowledge, this I understand, but when you define them as contributing to the process of acquiring knowledge, I'm not quite
Yes, okay, thank you. So, I can say that this is one of the main reasons for which I think that we need this category. Because, in my opinion, emotions are not always epistemic. We are just in certain cases and under certain conditions. Because, as you say, we can bring also example about the detrimental function of emotions in knowledge. Okay, so in one way, kind of a manifesto, I can say, I wanted to show how they are beneficial as well. Because many times in our philosophical circle, we forgot it. Okay, so this is kind of more provocative stance. But then I can say, yes, we need this definition because, of course, they are not always beneficial. So we can recognize that under certain circumstances, so if they are fully integrated, there are some criteria, as the glue and trust criteria or other stuff that we can develop. We can recognize their epistemic function. So one example that I didn't bring to your attention was an example that is quite important for me that has to do with epistemic shame and epistemic wonder in the processes of acquiring knowledge. So of course we have shame. Let's just take shame, okay? Let's don't speak about wonder. But if we take shame, of course shame is very detrimental, and we know how it is used also, is manipulated for building social exclusion, discrimination, and stuff like this. But in certain situations, so for me the example was in dialogical interaction as a meiotic way of generation of knowledge, the epistemic shame is the recognition of our own mistakes as a preliminary stage for starting to challenge our assumption and developing knowledge. So very quickly I can say as a tool for critical thinking. Okay? So in this way, shame, that is usually a bad emotion, performs an epistemic function that in the Platonic account is fundamental. Without it, without recognizing first that we do not know, that we are full and imbued of mistakes and cognitive failures, etc. And if we do not feel ashamed of it as a way of purifying our cognitive mistakes, we cannot continue in the epistemic processes. So, yes. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciated the dynamic view of the integrated view you brought about emotions. And I think it's very well done. And you have this kind of very elaborated non-reductionist view of emotions. So my question is the mirror question you asked actually. So you have very, in a way, very strong assumption about emotions, which is labeling its epistemic emotions. At the same time, I think it's quite possible to understand it as very meaningful understanding as well. But obviously, there are some examples that pop up and that tend to bring counter things. So I would like to ask you about some maybe limit examples that would try to find out, in the proposed way of classifying your assumptions, to what extent we can go in this direction. And I have two main situations or kind of examples in which it might be, we might ask to what extent it's possible to have the framework of epistemic emotions as a whole framework for emotions. It has to do with, the whole work has to do with nonsense. Because your general view is to modes which will be in the end recovered or converted into sense. So if you have this kind of state thing, of course, it's quite incoherent with what you suggested. But if you take the reverse option, and go into, for example, the legislative option, then we will have a radical opposite view about something that could be named as a radical breach or rupture into the process, experiential, cognitive, or whatever. And this radical breach or rupture, we will stay in it, we will remain in it. And we won't have this natural move of either ever recovery into sense. So if we stay in this very moment of breach, rupture, crisis, I mean, we may find many words in order to give some content to this kind of moment. Is it still possible to name this kind of moments? It can be the moment of the trauma, for example, as well, which is a non-experience at that very moment. Even if, of course, we're going to have a PTSD process of traumatizing that will finally become something that we overcome. But if we don't go into this direction, which is, I understand, your way of doing it, but if we don't go into this direction but stick to this very moment of crisis, trauma, is it still possible to maintain the whole framework? I mean, isn't a counter-example? And what would you do?
Okay. Yeah. So, two things. I think that one objection to this approach from a general terms is that I'm taking emotions as too intelligent in some way. That this has been also an objection that has been moved to Martha Nussbaum's cognitive approach to emotions, right? So labeling emotions as epistemic seems that I always want to look at their capacity of epistemic success and making sense, as you said, etc. So it seems that is a notion related to epistemic power and also other problematic things from the ethics of knowledge. I'm taking this more from a conceptual point of view. I think that this kind of intelligence is not necessarily connected to epistemic success, because I think that this emotion can play a fundamental role also in trauma, aporetic states, situation of getting that something is paradoxical, that is problematic, and something like this. Why? So I'm thinking mostly at the literature on vulnerability as a virtue, so recognizing that something is affecting me, so it's producing something, create kind of a movement within myself for rebuilding and restructuring our epistemic landscape. But here again, it seems that I make them again as a motivation for reconstructing the landscape. So let's just focus at the moment of crisis and staying there. So I think that there are some states that are not so positive immediately. So if we think about curiosity and stuff like this, we say immediately, okay, they are nice. We need to, for example, to teach students to be curious, asking questions, etc., etc. But the things about the bewilderment, we say this in German, right? This inquietude, this situation that you are not good in a situation. So a negative and painful situation as epistemic, because the self-understand, you really understand that something is that the thing that is going on is problematic, right? So here I think that the point is to look at negative emotions the beginning as an objection to my account of this very intelligent and positive emotion, and show how also this, what is labeled as negative feelings or emotion are epistemic. So, for example, I started to read a new book by Michael Brady titled Epistemic Suffering, and he used again the references of virtue epistemology, but he would like to show how the experience of suffering is epistemic. We really need to experience it in some way. So I don't have a definite answer to your question, but I just see a direction. So the objection could be, look at this negative experience. These are against your conception of very intelligent emotions that lead to epistemic success and epistemic power. And my answer to the objection will be to, look, all these experiences are epistemic too, in different ways. So we need to understand and fine-grain their functions, etc., etc. But I think that in the same epistemic shame or epistemic wonder, the Platonic Tsaumadzein, we really find this good example for replying to it. But, yeah. Okay.
I'm just wondering how it's important maybe to detail, because you insisted on motivation or directiveness as possibilities to understand the kind of motivation we have, which is at work in epistemic. So
yes, right. Right.
Because maybe it could be interesting to have to understand one component of epistemic emotion as something that is an output, like the one we have in complexity,
Yeah.
with questioning, and it's something different than motivation.
Yes.
And directness.
Yes, right.
I'm just wondering how to complement a person that you suggested.
Yeah.
It's a very naive view on a non-philosopher, so it's more concerned with practical knowledge of economics. And it leads to the last point, because I have the sense that I lack a definition of what we mean by knowledge, and I come back to this in mind, particularly to the notion of complexity. My feeling on economics is that we are in a state where we start to acknowledge the idea that the economic phenomena are complex. So example, even exposed, if you look at the dynamic thing, it's very difficult to define something as the reliability part of it. But to define something as good knowledge, something that we understand the world and we go in the right directions. And I have the thing that when you say epistemic, it's very difficult to define the reliability and define what you mean by knowledge. Because if I take the crisis arguments, and I was thinking about Freud and thing, of course, when she was but it's good for acquiring other knowledge to not remember certain things. I think in the Freudian sense, and it's good to not remember traumas because you can continue living and acquire other knowledge. So in a complex world, it looks to me that when I listen to epistemic emotion, I have the feeling that there is always knowledge somewhere in a complex world. And this is my difficulty here, because then you end up with the reliability of knowledge as a kind of a final questions, but then is there something not circular in this general perspective? Really a naive question.
Yeah, I think that this is not so naive because it's related to this weakness of the marker of the cognitive that we can remodulate as the marker of the epistemic, right? It's just enough to add the adjective epistemic to everything that it is became epistemic, what is knowledge, right? So if I wanted to reply this within the traditional framework of epistemology, so I think that this has to do with school of thoughts, right? So if I have to speak from the point of view of epistemology, we have to say that knowledge is true beliefs okay, justified true beliefs, but there are challenges. So maybe we can say justified, reliable beliefs. So, but then I have the impression that we also need to look at epistemic practices, so not just at this very propositional account of knowledge. So what we mean for knowledge, the different practices that we undertake for getting information about the world, and also different levels. So it's not just knowledge, but also understanding, wisdom, so use plurals, concepts, etc. So I think that this question is not naive, and it points to a very ongoing redefinition of what is knowledge in contemporary philosophy and epistemology, etc. Here I try to provide a link between cognitive processes, affective processes, and knowledge. There are also people in philosophy of mind that they take that knowledge is just cognitive processes. So I'm taking a stronger definition of a knowledge as something that leads us to a reliable belief, but it's really just a belief or something. So there are others that say it's more understanding, that's something that included the first experience. So I think that there are problems in the field, and tensions, different way of getting to there, and yeah. You are
delayed by 10 minutes, and so thank you, Laura.
Thank you, thank you.
Pierre Livet is Professor Emeritus in Aix-Marseille University. I cannot summarize his vast bibliography. In recent years, his interest has focused on the epistemic value of emotion. I particularly point out one book, Émotion et rationalité morale, some articles, some papers about emotion and epistemic value of emotion. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Well, I think I have some answer to this question, and mainly to the main question, that is, in what situation and what context are we justified to speak about epistemic emotions? And as I have dynamical conception of emotions, that is, occurrent emotions are related to sort of confrontation between our expectation, the dynamics of our expectations, and from the environment part, the dynamics of environment, of course appreciated by relatively to our motivations and expectation. And so if there is a differential between the two dynamics, either the dynamics of environment increase and is in favor and accelerate our expectations, so to speak, or hinder our expectations and is an obstacle to them. And so in this framework, knowledge cannot be just to know that there is a true and justified belief in a static way. We have to think of knowledge as dynamical. And of course, what is dynamical knowledge? It is learning. And knowledge can be considered as not learning at some time and acquiring a result. And okay, it's finished, end of the story. But on the contrary, learning is ceaseless learning. Knowledge is ceaseless learning. And this allows to get rid of Gettier examples that falsify the idea that true and justified belief is knowledge, because the justification were not so reliable that people thought. So, but in this case, I restrict the field of my talk to real knowledge, that is knowledge that is engaged in ceaseless learning and ceaseless process of learning about the defects of the previous learning, as well as ensuring the robustness of the previous learning. So there are positive and negative emotions, and these emotions could be not beneficial to knowledge, but epistemic one, if their main effect has to be appreciated in this kind of dynamics of learning. So, but it is not, for example, if you take the example of music, as you have done, it is not just hearing music, it is learning music. At least try to sing with other people, or to play music, or something like that. And here it is ceaseless learning. If you just hear music, it could be habituation to a kind of music, and we don't control, and we cannot change, you cannot really see the defect of our judgment, musical judgment, and the like. So there are, if we consider ceaseless learning, there are different steps in with each of the steps we can associate some kinds of emotions, epistemic emotions. Of course, step one is it's the problem in Socrates is always showing to people that they have not understood something. And even if without Socrates, we can wonder whether or not we have grasped the meaning of something. Or we can be surprised, but in a kind of passive surprise, that is, well, what is it? It's a first step. And then we find a possible way of trying to understand the situation, and it implies, of course, a lot of activities, memorizing, reapplying past categories and try to modify it, and making a lot of inferences. And then, step 3, maybe we acquire a kind of understanding, but we have a reflection and say, well, is it really a good understanding or reliable understanding of the situation? And then we try to maybe most of the time other people help us to go to this step. They criticize criticism, make criticism to our way of understanding the situation. And then we have to revise our understanding. And step 4 is finding a way to revise this understanding and to answer the objections of other people, and to integrate the past our past inferences and corrected and revised inferences. And finally, step 5 is to make, we believe what we are, we have a real knowledge of the situation, but we have to test what is the robustness of this understanding. And in scientific research, you know that it is not only to publish a paper and to have made experiments that show something, but to submit the paper to not only to the criticism of other researchers, but also to experimenters that try to repeat the experiment. It's not well paid in rank factor, but it is now considered as a really necessity for research. That is to repeat and repeat, try to repeat the paper, because, for example, in psychology, we discovered that at least 40% of papers was not reputable. So here, the first final step is to ensure the robustness and the reliability of the knowledge. And so you have, of course, emotions related to these different steps, and mainly to the move from one step to another. Because, of course, step 1 is a move itself. It is a move for nothing is happened, and to epistemic surprise. That is, and you see, it's neither positive nor negative. It's a kind of mix of, it's difficult, somehow difficult to assign a valence to this kind of emotion. And step 2 is, of course, more positive emotions, but with the difficulty, and it is rather painful to find some new hypothesis, for example. But as soon as you have a new idea, it's pleasant to be surprised by your own mind, so to speak. And but you are not sure, so it is positive emotion, but with uncertainty. And step 3, feeling the need of revision, is at first a negative emotion, but it is also a kind of challenge. Well, what counter-argument could I find against this criticism? And or even if you criticize your own work, how to improve and how to find a way to escape the paradox or dilemma or difficulty, conceptual difficulty that as discovered. Because it is a discovery to discover a conceptual difficulty. For philosophers, it is the main result. And of course, you kind of emotion that combine this kind of anxiety related to uncertainty and this kind of not illumination, but something attractive when you have a risky hypothesis and try to experiment or to make inference starting from this hypothesis, and it find to be corroborated. So it's here a positive emotion. I think the more positive but on the list. And, but of course it could be not corroborated, and so it's also can be negative. But you see that it is not a positive or a negative emotion, but the duality between the two emotions, the kind of possibility of shifting from one the positive aspect of this kind of emotional situation to the negative one, and conversely, that is the emotional attitude. That is the emotional pattern that is epistemic. And of course, step 4, restoring coherence by smart revision. So, yes, is a positive emotion, of course. And step 5 is a bit tricky, because if you have shown that the experience can be repeated, and you have some robustness of your thesis, but you know that it could be there could be problems in the vicinity of your knowledge, and so there are also a margin of uncertainty, and you know that in your future of research, something would be maybe not disqualified, but not so well appreciated for the future researcher. So you see that, of course, if their epistemic emotions are sort of relation between emotional attitudes that can be in a positive or in a negative, or maybe in a free free valence, we have to manage this kind of duality, and here the notion of virtue can be used. I'm not a fanatic of virtue ethics. I think that ethics could dispense of virtue, maybe. You cannot not be virtuous and be ethics, and the contrary is possible. Because if you have rigorous ethics, virtue is a bit cannot be attained, so cannot be useful. But of course, rigorous ethics is not practicable, so there are problems. But here, if you take virtues as learning how to manage this kind of emotional dynamics, then it's really virtue that is not just habituation to usual ways of managing with research, but on the contrary, to ways of having a good reaction to when we are in the situations that are difficult. For example, we are very attached to an hypothesis, and then you have still to revise it. So this kind of program is also related to the management of the temporal dimensions of knowledge. That is, in the short term, you are motivated to demonstrate your hypothesis, but in the long term, you have to be prepared to revise some part of it. And of course, if you are not taking the long-term perspective, then it's not good for research at all, because the dynamic could have a short note. And in this kind, you see, in this way, you see, you can give an application to the notion introduced by John Elster, about transmutation of emotion. In a sense, you transmute the negative emotion of having to revise your paper in the excitement raised by the challenge of revising and finding counter-arguments and so on. Of course, if knowledge is ceaseless learning, learning is social. It's difficult to have a really efficient learning when you are alone, without the help of others. And so, in this, the people that learn something to you learn also the virtues, the epistemic virtues and emotional virtues of dealing with the different steps of research, because they have they have the experience of the relation between short-term situation and long-term situation, between finding attachment to an hypothesis and need to revision and possibility to revise it and to reach robustness. But this, the fact that learning is social and research is also interactive, there are problems, because in a team of research you could have people that are in step 1, people that are in step 2 and step 3, and of course if I'm desesperating to revise, to find a good revision of my paper, I'm a bit frustrated when I see the other people launching a new genius general hypothesis, or ascertain the robustness of his own experiment. So there are two, in researching, you have to deal with, to manage this kind of interactive relation. Not only, of course, negative interaction, but positive one. You can hope to find solution as the previous more advanced researchers have done. And so there are collective epistemic emotional emotions, and because of necessity to acquire, to learn how to manage this interaction between different emotional stance and stage. And finally, there is a problem of two problems. The problem of the organization of research. Of course, in a team, you have people that are different tasks. Some are really the real researcher, that is the postdoc. And then there are other people that try to manage to make the result of young researcher and the postdoc to improve the possibility that these results could be published in good reviews. It's the main job of the leader of the team in most domains. And that it is a difficult job, and so you see that he has to encourage postdoc to find to launch new hypotheses, and also to become more expert in revising their paper, and also, of course, at the end, to ensure the robustness of the results. And but you see that there are different roles. Young researchers and young researchers maybe be sources of revising the paper of others, and not only their one, or to suggesting new hypotheses, or the role of the leader is not the same. It's not just this interactive and competitive, cooperative, competitive relations. It is to ensure that the collective team could advance advance across the two steps, different steps. And the last point is the relation between science and society. Here again, there are epistemic social emotions. But of course, and there are virtues of the managing of relating different epistemic social emotions. That is the kind for up to the step I have only take as example scientific research, academic research. But here we have to consider epistemic emotions of people that are not scientists, but are also for whom the progression through the different steps is also a possibility. Maybe not the robustness, it's an academic need an academic expertise, but launching new hypotheses and mainly revising the current hypothesis is also a possibility for citizens that are not scientific research, because they can see the consequence of some experiments, and maybe better than scientists that work in their lab. But of course, there are also defects of this kind of division of learning, in a sense. It is that, and there are also emotional attitudes induced by this division. And for example, citizens have difficulties somehow to discriminate robust results from untested hypotheses. They are tempted to appreciate hypotheses from the perspective of the attractiveness for their own imagination of the hypothesis. And so it is not just the kind of attractivity that the researchers have in mind. And on the other side, a researcher has also attitudes that are related with their emotions with respect to the attitudes of citizens. That is, well, they don't know nothing in what is really a scientific experiment, and they confuse stupid therapy, for example, with really tested one, and so on and so forth. And so and on the other way, so they are tempted to disqualify the imagination of citizens in the scientific domain. But they are also trying to get grants and funds and money, and so to present our results are really the new therapy that everybody would want to get rid of cancer and something like that. And of course, it is always premature and hazardous announcement of results. So they have to be careful of that, because now citizens have access to the controversy between scientific people. So they don't know how to have a really scientific hypothesis, nor to revise them, nor to show their robustness or not, but they know what are the conflicts between scientists. And so you see in newspapers, these conflicts are the main, the papers are mostly on the conflict between scientists than the result or the robustness of result of scientific research. Because it is a problem, an emotional problem that is common to citizens and to researchers. And so, but researchers are not very have no evident obvious ability to deal with this kind of problem. But here we have social collective virtues, social epistemic, social emotional, epistemic emotion social virtues that consist in managing finding the good way of managing this kind of problems that are emotional problems, but also, of course, epistemic problems. And here they are really intricate, as science and society are also intricate. So, you see, I think that in order to really working on epistemic emotions, we need first to have a dynamical conception of knowledge, and second, to think not on one emotion or one another, a positive one or a negative one, but to focus on the way of managing the relation and the dynamics between the different aspects, different aspects of the same epistemic situation, but with its different emotional implicit dynamics.
Thank you, Pierre, for your proposal and your timeless. So, first.
Yes, thank you. I found this very clear and interesting. I work in an interdisciplinary research group, and I find that I profit most from my colleagues in ways that do not actually influence my hypotheses. So, and I do profit from their enjoyment and their interest in why the topic matters to them. And I think I could clarify the profit that I have as I get a clearer grasp of the object that we are all investigating from different angles. And that seemed to be, and I would count this as knowledge, as background knowledge. And I was just wondering if for you this would also count as this resonance, like this emotional resonance with just other people interested in the same things, the enthusiasm maybe, or the frustration. Whether that would count for you as an epistemic emotion, and where in those steps that would show up. So emotions that not specifically influence hypotheses, but just a general engagement with the topic.
It would count as part of the virtue, the collective virtue of the group, interdisciplinary group of research. Suppose that the interdisciplinary group is full of conflict, it would not be convenient. So, it's not the core of epistemic as related to knowledge, acquiring knowledge, emotions, but it is related to the management of the interactive part, interactive emotional, of course, part of this collective dynamic of learning. So it's a way to manage this interaction, to say, well, you are the specialist in this domain and I'm not, so okay, I take your contribution as correct and as a right one, and trust you. But of course, if everybody in a group was like that, maybe everybody will be happy, but something is missing. And what is missing is to say, that I'm not a specialist of your domain, could ask you as a question that could be intriguing for you. And intriguing is starting the dynamics and the different steps. So if you are not moving, contributing to the dynamics, if there are parallel dynamics, well, it's pluridisciplinary, but maybe not inter.
I'm wondering whether there are emotions which are blocking the emotional management of knowledge. And I'm thinking about fear. There could be fear in the process of knowledge building, fear about the results of the knowledge and the results of your research. For instance, there could be the fear to come to results which are questioning your whole universe of values, for instance. So that you are studying, for instance, network, and you came out not at a complementary relationship, but about anti-Semitism, regression, discrimination, and all this, and it's questioning the whole image of mankind, of the society as well. But there could be also that you are doing research and you are fearing, you are afraid to be an outsider because you are questioning the sacrosanct values of the results of research until now, and you would be excluded of academic community, and your job perspective would be over and so on. Or you could be in a dictatorship where some kind of knowledge has been decided, and you, if you are in biology in Soviet Union, you come to some results, you would go to Siberia. So the role of fear, I would point to.
Yes, fear is could be either an interactive inside of the team or mainly science society emotion in this case. Yeah. For Siberia, it was the case. But if I take the Gulag example, of course, I don't think it is here an epistemic emotion in the strong sense, because we know, the researcher know that is not sure, but he thinks that it's almost certain to be right. And of course, he fears from other reasons that are not epistemic in the strong sense, not related to the advancement of knowledge. But for values, it is a bit different. And it can, because here it is related to the way that in which the scientist can present the results to society. For example, racist English people, English well-known researcher was quoted by Nazi and prone eugénisme. But it has been a scientific hypothesis at the time. And too simplistic and with bad consequences. And so the scientific part was in the dynamics of knowledge, but the proposal of forbidding people with bad genes to have children is, of course, against our value. So here again, it's a problem for the presentation to society and to take into account the social consequences of the knowledge. And so there is, of course, the example of nuclear bomb. But here you have a lot of problems related to the Nazi, of course. The problem would have been different without the World War. Maybe Einstein would not have written this letter. So it's not on the core. Of course, fear to be an outsider in your discipline is an interactive, emotional, epistemic emotions.
Very effective.
Yes, and but the other kind of fear is not of the same kind.
Yes. So I'm thinking of the second step, the one of production of hypotheses, and it seems to me that learning is quite a creative process. So I'm thinking of the literature on lateral thinking. So this was just a suggestion, and if you have in mind also these things. And the specific question is about the disposition, the personal disposition towards research, I can say. So maybe being more confident or insecure, and these things that has to do also with self-esteem and stuff. So the question is, how do you take in your dynamical account this disposition as character traits, or are emergent properties from these dynamics between positive and negative emotions, or how? I think that this will be also the point for the discussion of epistemology and how much there could be a bridge or not regarding this point.
Well, at the second step, you need to imagine a hypothesis. And of course, it is itself dynamics, and you have to evoke to be open-minded to different hypotheses. But of course, you have to focus on one of them in order to develop the consequence of this hypothesis. And then, in order to revise, you have also to be open-minded. Because, of course, if you focus on your idea and nothing is good aside, you have a researcher have always argument to say, well, it's not relevant, or it's bad knowledge or something like that. And this is not a good epistemic way to a good management of epistemic emotions, of course. So to be open-minded is needed at, say, any of the steps, maybe. But we have not to be open-minded. Everybody is in the team has not to be open-minded. Because if you have just open-minded, what you say is okay, and but, well, there's no sufficiently stronger criticism and no reason to revise. So there is in this case also, there are two sides of being open-minded. One is to be open to different perspectives, and the other is to find the tricky point of others and your own work. Okay. Yeah. First, there is a surprise that would be a kind of surprise that is a bit outside this restricted focus on knowledge and maybe a scientific one. It is the surprise that we have, but we have a category in our mind that immediately can qualify the situation. So, temporary surprise and no effect on our knowledge. But of course, you have other kind of surprise that are initial, and as you say, it's like open-mindedness, because it's the way when something is need that you can be more open-minded than previously. And then you are surprised, epistemic surprise. So you can find it, you are right, at each step it's the dynamic of the environment surprised you, but you have no immediate response, you have no immediate answer, and it induces in your knowledge some change of your categories.
Okay. Thank you for the great presentation. I really liked how you evoke the sensation of being a researcher and being confronted with your faults and having to correct, and how that, I mean, if you get a review from a journal, that kind of moment, I'm not sure if you want to actually read it right now. That's very emotional. It's a very emotional part of my research. I do want to kind of come back to this point of an example, I don't know, the gulag or whatever. I mean, we don't have to even go that far. You made reference to, for example, funding. I mean, one of the things in terms of fear that may be, deciding even what the hypothesis is, what it is you want to study is it being funded? And in that case, there's the broader question of the market. Is this something that might be profitable for someone who's willing to fund your research, for example? And of course, there's all sorts of scandals and stuff that have been associated with that in recent years as well. So I just thought maybe you could address that market context and maybe the emotional connection to funding.
Yes, but it's a case of science society problem. When the society is funding research, of course, and when it's a particular, not society as a whole, but particular interest of parts of the society, of firms, organizations, and the like, including public organization. You could think also about that. But mainly it's firms that, of course, the problem is not that the origin of funds is private firms. It is that, as you know, firms pay researchers in order to write papers that are not in favor of, but that disqualify and show that results of paper unfavorable to the product of this firm are cancerogen and the like. In this case, of course, you see that the researchers are engaged in a way in which, of course, the production of knowledge is goes in the wrong way, and so it's a perversion of knowledge. But it's not entirely new. You see, as a scientist in, for example, take Leibniz, he was paid by the elector of Hanover, and he was roughly independent, but he has to done a lot of, and maybe to. The controversy with Newton was not also devoid of national conflicts. So it's not really new, but it is a fear that the dynamic of knowledge could be hindered by that, this tendency.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you.